Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Booth Ellery had been driving the Central Valley corridor for 11 years, and he knew the Tule fog the way a sailor knows storm clouds. It wasn't like regular fog that rolled in and burned off with the morning sun. Tule fog settled into the low spots between Bakersfield and Stockton like something alive, something that had decided to stay. It turned Highway 99 into a white tunnel where your headlights bounced back at you and the taillights ahead could vanish between one breath and the next. The agriculture reports called it a seasonal phenomenon. The truckers who worked the valley called it something else. It was just past 9 in the evening when Booth started seeing the advisories on his phone. The National Weather Service had issued a dense fog warning for Kern and Tulare counties, visibility dropping to near zero in some areas, multiple vehicle accidents already reported near Lost Hills. He was northbound on CA 99 with a load of almonds headed for a distributor in Modesto, and he had two choices. He could pull into the truck stop at Bakersfield and wait it out, losing 4 hours of drive time and arriving late for his morning delivery window. Or he could push through the fog like he had done dozens of times before, trusting his experience and his equipment to get him through safely. Booth made the same choice he always made. He kept driving. The fog wasn't visible yet, not from where he sat just south of the grapevine, but he could see it in the distance like a white wall stretched across the valley floor. It looked solid enough to touch, dense enough to stop a truck cold. As he descended from the mountains into the valley, the temperature dropped fast. His thermometer showed 58 degrees at the summit, then 52, then 46 as he reached the flats. The moisture in the air condensed on his windshield, and he turned his wipers on intermittent to clear the gathering film. The first tendrils of fog appeared around mile marker 215, thin wisps that drifted across the highway like smoke. Within 5 miles, the wisps had become a solid presence that pressed against his windshield and turned his world into a tunnel of white light. Booth reduced his speed from 65 to 45, then to 35, as visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. His headlights became almost useless, reflecting back at him from the water droplets suspended in the air. He switched to his fog lamps, mounted low on his front bumper, and the improvement was marginal but real. He could see the white line at the edge of his lane, the yellow center divider, and the dim glow of taillights somewhere ahead in the soup. Other trucks were pulling over, their hazard lights blinking orange in the fog as they waited for conditions to improve. Booth understood the instinct, but he also understood the danger. A stopped truck on the shoulder was invisible in this fog until you were right on top of it, and more than one driver had been killed by vehicles that couldn't stop in time. If you were going to wait out the fog, you needed to be completely off the highway, behind a barrier or in a designated rest area. Otherwise, you kept moving, slow and steady, trusting your instincts and your reflexes to keep you alive. The CB radio crackled to life with the familiar voices of drivers calling out their positions and warning each other about hazards. There was a four-wheeler sideways in the median near mile marker 198. There was a pickup truck with no lights on drifting between lanes near Early Mart. There was a produce truck stuck on the shoulder with a blown tire, flares set out behind it but barely visible in the fog. Booth listened to the chatter and filed away the information, his eyes never leaving the road ahead. The white line was his lifeline, the only constant in a world that had been reduced to noise and moisture and the low rumble of his diesel engine. The strange part started around mile marker 187, just north of Delano. Booth had been monitoring Channel 19 on his CB, listening to the usual traffic reports and driver complaints, when he heard something that made him reach for the volume knob. It was a voice he didn't recognize, male and strained, speaking slowly as if the words were difficult to form. The message itself was simple enough, almost mundane, but something about the delivery made Booth's skin crawl. "Northbound at marker 187, the voice said. "Watch for the exit. Don't take the exit. Keep straight." The transmission ended with a burst of static, and Booth waited for someone to respond or for the speaker to clarify, but the channel went silent. He checked his mirror and saw nothing but fog, checked his GPS and saw the familiar blue line of CA99 stretching north toward Fresno. There was an exit coming up in half a mile, County Road J22, a two-lane farm road that connected to the small communities east of the highway. Booth had never used that exit, had no reason to use it now, but the warning on the CB had planted a seed of unease in his mind. As he approached the exit, his headlights caught something that shouldn't have been there. The exit sign was illuminated, but underneath the standard green rectangle showing the county road number, someone had added a second sign. It was hand-painted, white letters on a brown background, and it read, "Food, Fuel, Lodging, 2 miles." Booth had driven this stretch of highway hundreds of times, and he knew there was nothing on County Road J22 except farmland and a few scattered houses. No truck stops, no restaurants, no services of any kind. He keyed his CB microphone and spoke into the void. "This is Booth Ellery, northbound at marker 187. Anybody know what's on County Road J22? I'm seeing signs for services, but I don't think there's anything out there." The response came immediately, but it wasn't the voice from earlier. This was a woman, clear and businesslike, the kind of voice you heard from experienced drivers who had been on the road for decades. "Negative on J22, driver. That road dead ends at an abandoned processing plant about 5 miles out. Nothing open out there for at least 10 years. Booth thanked her and continued north, but the unease didn't leave him. Someone had gone to the trouble of putting up fake signs on that exit, and in this fog, a confused or desperate driver might be tempted to follow them. He thought about calling the highway patrol to report it, but his cell phone showed no signal in this part of the valley. The towers were spaced far apart out here, and the fog played hell with radio transmissions. He made a mental note to report it when he reached Fresno, then pushed the incident out of his mind and focused on the road ahead. The fog grew thicker as he continued north, and Booth's world shrank to the space immediately in front of his bumper. He was navigating by feel as much as by sight, sensing the curve of the highway through the steering wheel, listening to the rhythm of his tires on the pavement for any change that might indicate he was drifting out of his lane. His speed had dropped to 25 miles per hour, and even that felt too fast when he couldn't see more than 30 feet ahead. Other trucks had disappeared from the highway, either pulled over to wait or taking alternate routes to avoid the worst of the fog. Booth seemed to be alone out here, alone in the white void, with only his instruments and his instincts to guide him. The voice came back on the CB around mile marker 179. It was the same strained male voice from earlier, but this time the words were different, and the urgency was unmistakable. "Northbound at marker 179. The exit is wrong. Don't follow the signs. Stay on the main road." Booth grabbed his microphone. "This is Booth Ellery. Who am I talking to? What's your handle?" Static filled the channel for several seconds, and then the voice returned, fainter now, as if the speaker was moving away from his radio. "They changed the signs in the fog. They move them around. If you follow them, you won't come back." Before Booth could respond, another voice cut in, this one irritated and sharp. "Who the hell is clogging up the channel with this garbage? If you got a legitimate traffic report, give it. Otherwise, get off 19. The strained voice didn't respond, and after a moment, the channel returned to its normal pattern of position reports and hazard warnings. Booth checked his GPS again and saw that he was approaching another exit. This one for Avenue 48, a standard agricultural crossroad that led into the grid of farm roads that covered the valley. The exit sign was clearly visible in his fog lamps, standard green and white, exactly where it should be. But as he drew closer, he saw something that made him tap his brakes. There was a second sign, positioned about 50 yards before the actual exit. It was identical to the official sign. Same green background, same white letters, same reflective material. But it was marking an exit that didn't exist, pointing to a gap in the shoulder where there was no off-ramp, no paved surface, just a rough patch of dirt that dropped away into the agricultural fields beyond. If a driver was going too fast or wasn't paying close attention, they could easily mistake the fake sign for the real one and drive straight off the highway into the field. Booth slowed to a crawl and examined the fake sign as he passed it. The construction was professional. Not some crude hand-painted job, but an actual road sign that looked like it came from a highway department warehouse. Someone had gone to considerable effort to create a convincing replica and position it in exactly the wrong place. In good weather and clear visibility, the deception would be obvious. But in fog like this, with visibility measured in feet rather than yards, a driver could easily be fooled. He keyed his CB again. Attention northbound traffic on 99. There's a fake exit sign at Avenue 48 positioned about 50 yards early. Real exit is clearly marked, but the fake one could cause you to drive off the road. Use caution. The business-like woman's voice came back immediately. Copy that. I'm about 10 miles behind you. I'll keep an eye out. You might want to call the CHP when you get a signal. Booth acknowledged and continued north, but his mind was working through the implications of what he had seen. 2 fake signs in less than 10 miles, both positioned to lure drivers off the main highway and onto roads that led to nothing. The warning voice on the CB, strained and urgent, telling him not to follow the signs. And the fog, thick as cotton and showing no signs of lifting, creating perfect conditions for confusion and misdirection. He thought about the stories he had heard over the years, urban legends shared by truckers in rest stops and on CB channels during long night drives. Stories about hijackers who set up fake accidents to stop trucks and rob the drivers. Stories about human traffickers who used distress calls to lure Good Samaritans into traps. Stories about people who had disappeared on lonely highways and were never seen again. Most of the stories were exaggerations or outright fabrications, campfire tales told to pass the time and add a little excitement to the monotonous routine of driving. But some of them, Booth knew, were based on real incidents that had happened to real drivers. The fog showed no signs of lifting as he continued north through Tulare County. If anything, it seemed to be growing denser, pressing against his windshield like a living thing that wanted to smother his truck and drag it down into the white void. The temperature had dropped to 42 degrees, and Booth could see frost forming on the edges of his windshield where the defroster couldn't reach. His wipers were leaving streaks across the glass, and he made a mental note to replace them when he reached Modesto. Small details like that could mean the difference between life and death when you were driving in conditions like this. Around mile marker 165, Booth started seeing lights in the fog. They were faint at first, just a dim glow off to the right side of the highway, pulsing slowly like emergency flashers. As he got closer, the lights resolved into a pattern he recognized. The rectangular outline of a truck trailer, hazard lights blinking at each corner. Someone was stopped on the shoulder, and given the density of the fog, they were probably having mechanical problems or waiting for the weather to improve. Booth's instinct was to check on them, to see if they needed assistance or at least to make sure they were safely off the road. It was the kind of thing truckers did for each other, part of the unwritten code of the highway. But something about the situation felt wrong. The truck was positioned too perfectly, square to the shoulder with exactly the right spacing from the edge of the pavement. The hazard lights were too bright, too visible in the fog, as if someone had installed extra powerful bulbs to make sure the truck could be seen from a distance. And there was no sign of activity around the vehicle. No driver standing outside smoking a cigarette or checking under the hood. No indication that anyone was actually in distress. Booth slowed as he approached, his eyes scanning for details. The trailer was unmarked, no company name or DOT number visible on the sides. That wasn't unusual for owner-operators, but combined with everything else, it added to his unease. As he drew alongside the stopped truck, he could see into the cab through the fog, and what he saw made him press down on the accelerator and keep moving. The cab was empty. No driver, no passenger. Just an empty seat and a dashboard with all the lights off. The truck was running. He could hear the idle of the diesel engine and see the faint shimmer of exhaust in the fog, but there was nobody inside. He grabbed his CB microphone. Northbound traffic on 99, there's an empty truck at mile marker 165, right shoulder. Engine running, but no driver visible. Hazard lights are on. Looks like it might be a setup of some kind. The response came from a new voice, deep and authoritative, the kind of voice that commanded attention. "This is Big Joe westbound at marker 170. I saw that same truck about 20 minutes ago when I passed through. Cab was empty then, too. I called it into CHP, but couldn't get through. You might want to keep moving and stay alert." Booth acknowledged and increased his speed to 30 miles per hour, eager to put distance between himself and the suspicious vehicle. In his mirrors, he could see the glow of the hazard lights fading into the fog behind him, and he wondered how many other drivers had stopped to help and what had happened to them. The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold air seeping into his cab. The CB crackled again, and this time it was the strained voice from earlier, more urgent than before. "They're using the trucks as bait. They wait in the fog and take whoever stops. Keep moving. Don't trust the lights." Before Booth could respond, the voice cut off with a burst of static that made him wince and pull the microphone away from his ear. He tried calling back, asking for clarification, asking for a position report or a handle he could use to identify the speaker. But the channel remained silent except for the usual background noise of distant conversations and atmospheric interference. Mile marker 158 brought another exit, this one for Goshen Avenue. Booth knew this area well, had taken this exit many times to grab food or fuel at the truck stop that sat just off the highway, but as he approached, he saw something that made his stomach tighten. There were two exit signs, both identical, both pointing in slightly different directions. One marked the actual exit, the paved off-ramp that curved away to the right toward the truck stop. The other, positioned about 30 yards earlier, pointed to a rough dirt track that disappeared into the fog and the darkness beyond. Booth slowed to a crawl and examined both signs carefully. The fake one was convincing, professionally made with the same fonts and colors as the real sign. But the placement was wrong, just wrong enough to send an unwary driver onto a dirt road that could lead anywhere. He thought about the empty truck he had passed, thought about the warning voice on the CB, thought about all the small details that had been accumulating since he entered the fog. Someone was out here in the darkness, setting traps for drivers, using the fog and fake signs and abandoned trucks to create confusion and fear. He keyed his CB one more time. "This is Booth Ellery northbound at Goshen Avenue. There's another fake exit sign here, positioned early. Real exit is clearly marked. Whatever is going on out here tonight, it's not random. Somebody is deliberately trying to lure drivers off the highway." The businesslike woman's voice came back. "Copy that, Booth. I'm at marker 168 now. I've seen 3 of those fake signs so far. I think you're right about this being deliberate. Question is, what are we supposed to do about it?" Booth had been asking himself the same question. The obvious answer was to call the highway patrol, but cell phone coverage was non-existent in this part of the valley, and the fog was playing hell with radio transmissions. He could try using his CB to relay a message through other drivers, but that assumed someone was monitoring the channels and willing to help. The other option was to keep driving, stay alert, and hope that whoever was behind this lost interest or moved on to easier targets. He chose to keep driving. The fog was still thick, but he had been making steady progress north, and Fresno was only about 40 miles ahead. Once he reached the city limits, he could find a highway patrol station or a truck stop with a working phone and report everything he had seen. In the meantime, he would stay on the main highway, ignore any signs or lights that didn't feel right, and trust his instincts to keep him safe. The next 20 miles passed in tense silence. Booth kept his speed steady at 30 miles per hour, his eyes scanning constantly for hazards or anomalies. He saw more fake signs, at least 3 more that he could identify, all positioned to lead drivers off the highway and onto side roads that went nowhere. He saw another empty truck on the shoulder, this one with its door hanging open and its interior lights on, creating an even more convincing tableau of distress. He saw lights moving in the fields beside the highway, flashlights or vehicle headlights, impossible to tell which, but always keeping pace with his truck as he drove north through the fog. Around mile marker 142, the strained voice came back on the CB one final time. The message was brief, delivered in a whisper that Booth had to strain to hear over the static. "They're following you now. 3 vehicles. They think you don't know. When you reach the rest area at marker 135, don't stop. Keep going. I'll try to help." The transmission ended, and despite Booth's repeated attempts to raise the speaker, there was no response. He checked his mirrors and saw nothing but fog, checked his GPS and saw the rest area ahead, marked as a standard highway facility with parking, restrooms, and vending machines. He had stopped there dozens of times before, had never seen anything unusual or threatening about the place. But tonight, with the fog and the fake signs and the mysterious voice warning him about followers, the rest area felt like a trap waiting to spring. Booth made his decision. He would pass the rest area without stopping, would continue north to Fresno in the relative safety of civilization. Whatever was happening out here in the fog, whatever game was being played with fake signs and empty trucks and cryptic CB warnings, he wanted no part of it. He had a load to deliver, a family waiting for him at home, and a healthy respect for situations that felt wrong at a gut level. The rest area appeared in his headlights, a cluster of buildings and parking spaces barely visible through the fog. True to his decision, Booth stayed in the right lane and maintained his speed, watching the facility slide past his window without slowing down. As he passed the entrance ramp, he saw something that confirmed his instincts were correct. There were 3 vehicles parked near the exit, positioned so they could quickly pull onto the highway. 2 pickup trucks and a large SUV, all with their engines running, all with their lights off. Waiting. Booth pressed down on the accelerator and felt his truck surge forward, increasing speed to 40 miles per hour despite the limited visibility. In his mirrors, he saw the 3 vehicles pull onto the highway behind him, their headlights cutting through the fog as they accelerated to match his speed. They weren't trying to hide anymore. They knew he had seen them, knew he wasn't going to stop, and they were no longer concerned about maintaining the pretense of normalcy. His CB erupted with voices, multiple people talking at once, some shouting warnings and others demanding that he pull over. Booth ignored them all and focused on the road ahead, on keeping his truck between the white line and the yellow divider, on maintaining enough speed to stay ahead of his pursuers without losing control in the fog. His hands were steady on the wheel, his breathing was controlled, and his mind was clear. This was what 11 years of driving had prepared him for. the ability to stay calm when everything around him was chaos. The 3 vehicles stayed behind him for the next 5 miles, matching his speed but not closing the distance. They seemed content to follow, to keep him in sight, perhaps waiting for him to make a mistake or run into an obstacle that would force him to stop. Booth knew the highway ahead, knew there were no more exits for the next 10 miles, knew that if he could maintain his lead until he reached the outskirts of Fresno, he would have multiple options for escape and assistance. Around mile marker 130, something changed. The fog began to thin, not dramatically, but enough that Booth could see farther ahead, could make out shapes and details that had been invisible just minutes before. With the improved visibility came the return of normal traffic, other trucks and cars that had been waiting out the worst of the fog and were now resuming their journeys. Booth merged into the flow of vehicles and felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. There was safety in numbers, and his 3 pursuers would have a harder time isolating him with witnesses around. The vehicles behind him seemed to reach the same conclusion. As the traffic density increased and the fog continued to lift, they dropped back and eventually disappeared, either exiting the highway or simply giving up the chase. Booth kept checking his mirrors for the next 15 miles, but the 3 vehicles never reappeared. By the time he reached the truck stop on the north side of Fresno, the fog had lifted completely, and the night sky was clear and star-filled, as if the past 2 hours had been nothing but a dream. Booth pulled into the truck stop parking lot and sat in his cab for several minutes, hands still on the wheel, heart rate slowly returning to normal. The lot was busy with trucks coming and going, drivers grabbing food or fuel before continuing their journeys. Everything looked normal, ordinary, exactly as it should be. But Booth couldn't shake the feeling that he had just survived something dangerous, something that would have ended very differently if he had made different choices, or if his instincts had failed him. He grabbed his phone and was relieved to see full signal bars. His first call was to the California Highway Patrol, and he spent 20 minutes giving a detailed statement about the fake signs, the empty trucks, the mysterious CB warnings, and the 3 vehicles that had followed him through the fog. The dispatcher took his information seriously and said they would send units to investigate the areas he had identified. She also told him something that made his blood run cold. There had been 2 truck drivers reported missing in the past month, both last seen on CA-99 during foggy conditions, both hauling high-value cargo that would be attractive to hijackers. His second call was to his dispatcher, explaining why he would be late for his delivery and requesting permission to stay at the Fresno truck stop until morning. The dispatcher granted the request without hesitation, clearly hearing the strain in Booth's voice. His final call was to his wife, just to hear her voice and reassure himself that the world outside the fog was still normal and safe. As Booth walked into the truck stop restaurant, he saw a familiar face sitting at the counter. It was the businesslike woman from the CB, the one who had been confirming his reports about the fake signs. She was older than he expected, probably in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades on the road. She looked up as he approached and gave him a nod of recognition. "You made it through," she said. It was a statement, not a question. "Barely," Booth replied, sliding onto the stool next to her. "Did they follow you too?" "No, I took Highway 41 north from Kettleman City when I heard how bad the fog was getting. Sounds like I made the right choice." They talked for an hour, comparing notes about what they had seen and heard. The woman, whose name was Patricia, had been driving the valley for 23 years and had never seen anything like tonight. She had heard stories about fake signs and hijackings, but always dismissed them as urban legends. Now she wasn't so sure. "The thing that bothers me most," Patricia said, "is the voice on the CB, the one warning you about the exits and the followers. Who was that? And how did they know what was happening? Booth had been wondering the same thing. The strained voice had provided accurate information about threats he couldn't see, had warned him away from traps before he could fall into them, had somehow known that 3 vehicles were following him through the fog. The most logical explanation was that someone else had fallen victim to whatever was happening out there, and was trying to help other drivers avoid the same fate. The less logical explanations, the ones that Booth didn't want to think about too carefully, were much darker and more disturbing. Booth managed 3 hours of sleep in his cab before the sound of diesel engines and air brakes jolted him awake. The Fresno truck stop was coming alive with the morning shift, drivers gulping coffee and checking their loads before heading back onto the highway. Through his windshield he could see clear blue sky and the kind of crystalline winter sunlight that made the previous night feel like a fever dream. The Thule fog had burned off completely, leaving no trace of the white wall that had swallowed the valley just hours before. He checked his phone and found 2 missed calls from the California Highway Patrol. The voicemail was brief and professional. Units had been dispatched to investigate the locations he had reported, but they had found no evidence of fake signs, abandoned trucks, or suspicious vehicles. The officer speaking suggested that the fog may have caused optical illusions, or that other drivers had already removed any hazards before the patrol arrived. The tone was polite but skeptical, and Booth could read between the lines. They thought he had been seeing things, mistaking shadows and reflections for something more sinister. Booth sat in his cab and replayed the previous night in his mind, testing his memories for inconsistencies or signs of hallucination. But everything remained crystal clear. The fake exit signs with their professional construction and deliberate placement, the empty trucks with engines running and hazard lights flashing, the 3 vehicles that had followed him through the fog, the strained voice on the CB warning him about traps and pursuers. None of it felt like imagination or stress-induced paranoia. It had been real, and the fact that the highway patrol couldn't find evidence only made the situation more disturbing. He called his dispatcher and confirmed that he would continue to Modesto for his delivery. The load of almonds was still secure in his trailer, and he was already 12 hours behind schedule. His dispatcher seemed relieved to hear from him and made no mention of the previous night's incident. Booth had the distinct impression that someone at the company had received a call from the highway patrol and had decided not to make an issue of it as long as he completed his delivery without further drama. The drive from Fresno to Modesto should have taken less than 2 hours on a clear morning, but Booth found himself taking it slow, hyper-aware of every exit sign and every vehicle that appeared in his mirrors. The highway looked completely different in daylight, familiar and ordinary, with no hint of the menace that had saturated every mile the night before. Other trucks passed him doing 70 in the fast lane, their drivers probably wondering why he was crawling along at 55 in perfect conditions. Booth didn't care what they thought. Something had happened out there in the fog, something that made him question his assumptions about safety and visibility and trust. He reached the distribution center in Modesto just after 11 in the morning and spent the next 2 hours getting his load unloaded and his paperwork processed. The warehouse workers were efficient and friendly, making small talk about the weather and the upcoming holidays. Nobody asked him about his trip or why he was so late. It was just another delivery, routine and forgettable, exactly the way it was supposed to be. Booth found the normalcy both comforting and unsettling. How could the world feel so ordinary when just 12 hours ago he had been running from pursuers through fog that turned highways into mazes? After completing his delivery, Booth drove to a truck stop on the north side of Modesto and parked in a corner spot away from the main traffic flow. He needed time to think, to process what had happened, and to decide whether he was going to say anything more to anyone about the previous night. His first instinct was to let it drop, to accept the highway patrol's explanation and move on with his life. But something kept nagging at him, a detail that didn't fit with the comfortable narrative of fog-induced confusion. The detail was the voice on the CB radio, the strained male voice that had warned him about fake exits and followers. That voice had provided specific information that Booth had no way of knowing, information that turned out to be accurate when he followed the warnings. If he had been hallucinating or imagining threats, how could the voice have known about the 3 vehicles following him before Booth himself was aware of them? The only logical explanation was that someone else had been out there in the fog, someone who could see what Booth couldn't see, and who had chosen to help him escape. Booth pulled out his CB radio and scrolled through the recorded conversations from the previous night. Most CB radios didn't have recording capability, but Booth had installed an upgraded unit 2 years ago that automatically saved the last 48 hours of Channel 19 traffic. He found the first warning from the strained voice, time-stamped at 9:47 p.m., and listened to it again with fresh attention. Northbound at marker 187. Watch for the exit. Don't take the exit. Keep straight. The voice was male, probably middle-aged, with an accent that suggested rural California, but not the valley specifically. There was something else in the voice, too, something Booth hadn't noticed during the stress of driving through the fog. The speaker sounded exhausted, worn down, as if he had been awake for days or had been through something traumatic. The words were clear enough, but the delivery had a hollow quality that made Booth's skin prickle. He advanced to the second warning, recorded at 10:12 p.m. They changed the signs in the fog, they moved them around. If you follow them, you won't come back. This time, Booth caught something he had missed before. In the background of the transmission, behind the strained voice, there was another sound. It was faint and almost buried in the static, but once Booth heard it, he couldn't unhear it. It was the sound of a diesel engine idling, the distinctive rumble of a truck with the specific pitch and rhythm that came from older mechanical engines rather than modern electronic fuel injection. The voice wasn't coming from a base station or a handheld radio. It was coming from someone sitting in a truck, probably an older model based on the engine sound. The third warning, recorded at 10:38 p.m., was the most disturbing. They're following you now. 3 vehicles, they think you don't know. When you reach the rest area at marker 135, don't stop. Keep going. I'll try to help. Booth listened to this recording 3 times, analyzing every nuance. The speaker had known about the 3 vehicles before Booth saw them in his mirrors. The speaker had known about the rest area ahead and had warned Booth not to stop. Most importantly, the speaker had said, "I'll try to help," implying some kind of intervention or action beyond just radio warnings. But Booth had seen no sign of help arriving, no other truck or vehicle that might have belonged to the mysterious voice. The 3 pursuers had eventually broken off the chase on their own, not because of any outside interference, unless the help had been more subtle, unless the person behind the strained voice had done something to make the pursuers think twice about continuing the chase. Booth had no way of knowing, but the thought lodged in his mind and wouldn't let go. He spent the next hour searching online for information about missing truckers in Central California. The Highway Patrol had mentioned 2 drivers in the past month, but Booth wanted more details. He found news articles about a driver from Oregon who had disappeared near Kettleman City 3 weeks ago. The man's truck had been found abandoned on the shoulder of CA 99, with the engine running and the driver's personal belongings still in the cab. No signs of foul play, no indication of where the driver had gone. The official theory was that he had suffered some kind of medical emergency and wandered off in confusion, but search teams had found no trace of him despite days of combing the area. The second case was even more troubling. A driver from Nevada had vanished near Delano 6 weeks ago. His truck discovered in a similar condition. Engine running, personal effects present. Driver gone without explanation. The Highway Patrol had investigated both cases as potential kidnappings or hijackings, but with no witnesses and no evidence, the investigations had stalled. Both drivers were still officially missing, their families still waiting for answers that might never come. Booth read through the articles with growing unease. Both disappearances had occurred during foggy conditions. Both trucks had been found in locations that matched the areas where Booth had seen fake signs and suspicious vehicles the previous night. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Someone was using the Thule fog as cover for a systematic operation, targeting truckers who couldn't see well enough to recognize traps until it was too late. But why? Highway robbery was one possibility, but both missing drivers had been hauling relatively low-value cargo that wouldn't justify the elaborate setup Booth had encountered. Human trafficking was another option, though it seemed like an enormous risk to kidnap professional drivers who had regular schedules and would be quickly missed. The third possibility, the one that Booth kept trying to push out of his mind, was that someone was targeting truckers for reasons that had nothing to do with money or cargo. That someone was hunting drivers for sport or revenge or some twisted psychological need that defied rational explanation. Around 3 in the afternoon, Booth's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered cautiously, half expecting a sales call or wrong number. Instead, he heard a woman's voice, older and familiar. It took him a moment to place it as Patricia, the driver he had met at the Fresno truck stop the previous night. "I hope you don't mind me tracking down your number," Patricia said, without preamble. "I got it from the truck stop security footage and called your company. I figured we should talk about last night." Booth asked her what had prompted the call, and Patricia's response made him grip his phone tighter. "I drove back down 99 this morning, retracing the route we talked about. I wanted to see if I could find any evidence of those fake signs you reported. The Highway Patrol told me they came up empty, but I'm more persistent than they are. Did you find anything?" Booth asked. "Not at first, but then I stopped at a rest area near Pixley and got talking with the attendant there. Her name is Mirren O'Keefe, been working that rest stop for 15 years. She told me something interesting. Said that about twice a month during fog season, she sees trucks pull in late at night that look wrong to her. Empty cabs, engines running, but nobody around. She reports it to the Highway Patrol every time, but by the time they arrive, the trucks are always gone." Booth felt his pulse quicken. "Did she give you any specifics? Anything that might help identify who's behind this?" "Better than that. She keeps a log. Dates, times, descriptions of the trucks. I'm looking at it right now, and there are at least 20 incidents over the past 2 years. The pattern is clear. The trucks always appear during heavy fog, always on northbound or southbound 99, and they're always gone within an hour or 2 of being reported. Mirren thinks someone is using them as bait, same as you suggested. Park them on the shoulder with hazard lights flashing. Wait for good Samaritans to stop and help, then rob them, or worse. That matches what I saw last night," Booth said. "But here's the question I can't answer. Who was the voice on the CB? The one warning me about the traps?" Patricia was silent for several seconds before responding. "That's the part that bothers me too. I've been thinking about it all morning, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. The only person who could have known all those details, who could have seen the pursuers before you did, who could have warned you about specific exits and rest areas, would have to be someone who was also out there in the fog. Someone who knew the operation because they had encountered it before, or maybe even been part of it." The implication hung in the air between them. Booth voiced it aloud, testing how it sounded. "You think the voice belonged to one of the missing drivers. Someone who escaped or got away and is now trying to warn others. Or someone who didn't get away, Patricia said quietly. Someone who's still out there, still trapped in whatever hell those people created for them, and the only thing they can do is try to save other drivers from the same fate. Booth wanted to dismiss the idea as paranoid speculation, but it fit the facts better than any other explanation. The exhausted quality of the voice, the specific knowledge of the operation's tactics, the statement, "I'll try to help," that suggested someone working against overwhelming odds. If one of the missing drivers had somehow survived and was still in the area, still monitoring CB traffic and trying to interfere with the hijacking operation, it would explain everything Booth had experienced. "We need to talk to Myron," Booth said. "The rest, stop attendant. If she's been documenting this for 2 years, she might have information that could help identify the people behind it." Patricia gave him the address of the rest area and agreed to meet him there in 2 hours. Booth started his truck and pulled back onto CA 99, heading south toward Pixley. The sun was still high in the clear sky, and the highway looked innocent and ordinary. But Booth couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that somewhere out there in the invisible spaces between exits and mile markers, the people who had chased him through the fog were still operating, still setting traps, still waiting for the next wall of white to give them cover. The rest area at Pixley was a modest facility, just restrooms and vending machines and a small information kiosk. It sat on the northbound side of CA 9, surrounded by agricultural fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. A few trucks were parked in the lot, their drivers taking breaks or catching naps before continuing their routes. Everything looked normal, but Booth found himself scanning the area for anything suspicious, any detail that didn't fit the expected pattern. Patricia arrived 10 minutes after Booth and parked her truck next to his. She looked tired but determined, the kind of expression Booth recognized from drivers who had made up their minds to see something through regardless of the cost. They walked together to the information kiosk where Mirren O'Keefe was working, organizing maps and brochures on a display rack. Mirren was in her early 50s with red hair going gray and the weathered complexion of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. She looked up as they approached, and her expression shifted from polite professionalism to something more guarded. "You must be Booth," she said. "Patricia called ahead and told me you'd be coming. I'm not sure how much help I can be, but I'll tell you what I know." They sat at one of the picnic tables outside the kiosk, and Mirren pulled a small notebook from her jacket pocket. The notebook was filled with neat handwriting, dates and times and descriptions, recorded with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered. "I started keeping this log about 2 years ago, when I realized the highway patrol wasn't taking my report seriously. They kept telling me that empty trucks on the shoulder were probably just drivers who had to step away for personal reasons or mechanical issues. But I've been working this rest area for 15 years, and I know what normal looks like. These trucks weren't normal." She flipped through the pages, showing them entries that documented dozens of incidents. Each entry included the date, the approximate time the truck was first observed, a description of the vehicle, and notes about any unusual circumstances. What struck Booth immediately was the pattern. The incidents clustered around foggy nights between October and March, the peak months for tule fog in the Central Valley. And the descriptions of the trucks varied widely, different makes and models and years, suggesting that the operation wasn't using a single bait vehicle, but had access to multiple trucks that could be deployed as needed. "Have you ever seen anyone around these trucks?" Booth asked. "Anyone who might be setting them up or monitoring them?" Mirren shook her head. "That's the strange part. The trucks just appear, usually between 10 at night and 2 in the morning. I make rounds every hour to check the parking lot and restrooms, and I'll look out at the highway while I'm walking. Sometimes a truck will be there that wasn't there on my previous round. Engine running, lights on, but completely empty. I call it in to CHP, and by the time they arrive, the truck is always gone. Like someone is watching and knows exactly when to move it. "What about CB radio?" Patricia asked. "Have you ever heard anything unusual on the trucker channels during these incidents?" Mirren's expression changed, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "Actually, yes. I keep a CB in the kiosk to monitor emergency traffic, and about 6 months ago I started hearing a voice late at night during foggy conditions. A man's voice sounded strained or tired, giving warnings about fake exit signs and dangerous vehicles. I mentioned it to the highway patrol, but they said it was probably just a driver being paranoid or playing a prank. I wasn't so sure." Booth and Patricia exchanged glances. "Did you record any of these transmissions?" Booth asked. "No, but I remember some of what he said, things like, 'Don't trust the signs in the fog,' and 'they're using empty trucks as bait,' and 'if you see the lights, keep driving.' It was always on Channel 19, always between 10 and 2 in the morning, always during heavy fog. After a while, I started to think of him as the guardian angel of Highway 99, trying to keep drivers safe from something the rest of us couldn't see." Booth felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm afternoon sun. The voice Mirren described was the same voice that had warned him the previous night, which meant the mysterious speaker had been active for at least 6 months. That was a long time to maintain surveillance and provide warnings, especially if the person was operating alone and possibly in danger themselves. "Did the voice ever identify himself?" Patricia asked. "Ever give a name or a location?" "No, never. And whenever other drivers tried to contact him on the CB, he wouldn't respond. It was always one-way communication, just warnings and information, then silence." Mirren paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. "There was one night, about 3 months ago, when I heard something different. The voice came on Channel 19 like usual, but this time he sounded desperate. He said they found me, and then there was a lot of static and what might have been shouting or struggling. Then nothing. I haven't heard from him since that night." The three of them sat in silence, processing this information. If the guardian angel voice had been captured or killed 3 months ago, then who had been warning Booth the previous night? The voice had sounded similar. Same exhausted quality and same pattern of warnings. But if the original speaker was gone, either someone else had taken up the role or Booth had heard something that defied easy explanation. "There's one more thing," Mirren said, reaching into her notebook and pulling out a folded piece of paper. "About a year ago, I found this tucked under my windshield wiper. No envelope, no explanation, just this." She unfolded the paper to reveal a hand-drawn map of a section of Highway 99 between Bakersfield and Fresno. The map showed the locations of several exits, rest areas, and mile markers. But what made it significant were the red X marks scattered along the route, concentrated in certain areas like Delano, Pixley, and Goshen. Next to each X was a date and a single word. "Disappeared." Booth studied the map, feeling his stomach tighten. The X marks corresponded to the locations where Mirren had documented empty trucks in her log. They also matched the areas where Booth had encountered fake signs and suspicious activity the previous night. Someone had been tracking the disappearances, mapping them out, and had given that information to Mirren. The obvious question was why? Why give a rest stop attendant a map showing the pattern of criminal activity unless you wanted someone to understand what was happening and possibly do something about it? "Did you show this to the highway patrol?" Patricia asked. "Of course. They took a copy and said they would investigate, but as far as I know, nothing came of it. They told me the dates didn't match any reported crimes or accidents, so there was nothing they could do. I think they thought I was making it up or exaggerating the problem. Booth took photos of the map with his phone, making sure to capture all the details. The dates ranged from 14 months ago to as recently as 3 weeks ago, which matched the timeline of the 2 missing drivers he had read about online. If the map was accurate, there could be a dozen or more victims who had never been officially reported as missing, drivers whose disappearances had been attributed to job changes or personal decisions rather than foul play. "I need to ask you something that might sound strange," Booth said to Mirren. "When you heard the voice on the CB, the one warning drivers, did it ever sound like it was coming from someone who was injured or in pain? Like someone who had been through trauma?" Mirren considered the question carefully before answering. "Yes, actually. There was always something off about the voice, like he was struggling to speak or forcing the words out. I chalked it up to bad radio equipment or atmospheric interference, but now that you mention it, it did sound like someone in distress." The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made Booth deeply uncomfortable. A voice on the CB providing warnings for months, then going silent after saying, "They found me." A map showing the pattern of disappearances given anonymously to a rest stop attendant. Empty trucks appearing during foggy nights as bait for unsuspecting drivers. And now the voice had returned, warning Booth with the same exhausted tone and specific knowledge that suggested intimate familiarity with the operation. "I think we need to consider the possibility that we're not dealing with just one victim," Patricia said slowly. "Maybe the person warning drivers isn't trying to escape or get help. Maybe they're being forced to participate, and the warnings are their way of sabotaging the operation from the inside." The thought made horrible sense. If the hijackers had captured one of the missing drivers and were forcing them to monitor CB traffic or help identify targets, the captive might try to subvert the operation by warning potential victims. It would explain the one-way communication, the refusal to identify himself, and the desperate tone of the transmissions. It would also explain why the warnings had continued even after the original voice claimed "they found me." There might be multiple captives, each taking turns providing warnings whenever they had access to a radio. Booth felt sick thinking about it. Somewhere out there in the fog-shrouded valley, there could be truckers who had been kidnapped and were being held against their will, forced to participate in the same operation that had victimized them. And the only resistance they could offer was cryptic warnings on a CB radio, gambling that other drivers would hear and understand in time. "We need to find out where they're operating from," Booth said. "There has to be a base of operations, somewhere they can hold people in trucks without attracting attention, somewhere remote enough that nobody notices unusual activity." Mirren pulled out a larger map of the Central Valley and spread it on the picnic table. "If I had to guess, I'd look here." She pointed to an area east of Highway 99 between Delano and Pixley. "This whole region is agricultural land, mostly orchards and processing facilities. A lot of the properties are abandoned or minimally staffed during the off-season. It would be easy to use one of those locations as a base without anyone noticing." Patricia traced her finger along several county roads that branched off from the highway. These roads connect to dozens of properties. We're talking about hundreds of square miles to search, and that's assuming they're even in this general area. They could be operating from somewhere completely different and just using Highway 99 as their hunting ground. Booth knew she was right. Without more specific information, finding the base of operations would be nearly impossible. They needed evidence that would force the Highway Patrol to take the threat seriously and dedicate real resources to the investigation. They needed proof that couldn't be dismissed as fog-induced paranoia or coincidence. "The voice on the CB," Booth said. "That's our best lead. If we can establish contact and get more information about the operation, we might be able to pinpoint a location. but we'd need to do it during foggy conditions, when they're active, and when the voice has access to a radio. Patricia checked the weather forecast on her phone. There's another fog advisory for tonight. Dense tulle fog expected to develop after sunset, visibility near zero in some areas. If you're planning to go back out there and try to make contact, tonight would be the night. Booth felt his pulse quicken at the thought of driving back into the fog, deliberately putting himself in danger to chase after a voice that might belong to a ghost or a captive, or something he couldn't begin to understand. Every rational instinct told him to walk away, to file his report with the authorities and let them handle it. But he kept thinking about the missing drivers, about families waiting for answers, about someone trapped in darkness trying to save others from the same fate. "I'll do it," he said. "But I'm not going alone. Patricia, are you willing to run parallel on another highway and monitor CB traffic? Mirren, can you watch from the rest area and document anything unusual?" They both agreed without hesitation, and Booth felt a surge of gratitude for these two women who were willing to risk their safety for people they'd never met. They spent the next hour planning their strategy, identifying key mile markers and exits, establishing communication protocols, and agreeing on what constituted an emergency that would require calling in law enforcement. As the sun began to set and the temperature dropped, Booth could see the fog starting to form in the low areas of the valley. It looked like thin smoke at first, barely visible against the darkening sky, but he knew from experience that it would thicken rapidly once the sun was fully down, transforming the highway into the same white tunnel he had navigated the previous night. Somewhere out there in the gathering darkness, the people who set traps for truckers were preparing for another night of hunting. And somewhere else, possibly close by, a voice was waiting to speak again, to warn and guide and try to save one more driver from disappearing into the fog. Booth climbed into his truck and started the engine, checking his mirrors and his lights and his CB radio one final time. Patricia pulled out of the rest area ahead of him, heading toward Highway 41, where she would monitor traffic and provide backup communication. Mirren returned to her kiosk, her notebook open to a fresh page, ready to document whatever happened in the hours ahead. The shake was rolling in faster now, thick tendrils of white that obscured the fields and crept onto the highway. Booth took a deep breath, keyed his CB to Channel 19, and pulled onto CA 99 heading south. The voice had said, "I'll try to help." Tonight, Booth was going to return the favor. The fog descended on Highway 99 like a living curtain, faster and denser than the previous night. By the time Booth passed Fresno heading south, visibility had dropped to less than 20 feet, and the world had collapsed into that familiar white tunnel where distance and time lost all meaning. His headlights were useless, bouncing back from the moisture-laden air in a blinding reflection. He relied on his fog lamps and the broken white line at the edge of his lane, that thin stripe of paint becoming his only connection to reality. The CB radio crackled with familiar voices. Drivers were reporting the fog conditions, calling out their positions, warning each other about vehicles stopped on the shoulder or creeping along at dangerous speeds. Booth monitored the chatter on Channel 19 while keeping one hand on the wheel, and his eyes locked on the strip of asphalt he could actually see. Patricia checked in every 10 minutes from Highway 41, confirming she was parallel to his position and ready to relay messages if needed. Mirren reported from the Pixley rest area that traffic was light but steady, trucks pulling in to wait out the worst of the fog. Booth was southbound at mile marker 172 when he saw the first sign that something was wrong. It was a truck stopped on the right shoulder, hazard lights flashing in the fog, exactly like the abandoned vehicles from the previous night. But this time, Booth didn't slow down or consider stopping. He maintained his speed at 30 miles per hour and keyed his CB as he passed. Northbound traffic, there's a stopped truck at marker 172 southbound side. Can't confirm if it's occupied. Exercise caution if you're planning to render assistance. The response came from a driver heading north. Copy that. I'll keep my eyes open and report if I see anything unusual. Booth checked his mirrors but could see nothing except the glow of his own taillights reflecting in the fog. If someone was watching from that stopped truck, if someone was monitoring his CB transmissions and planning their next move, he had no way to detect them. The fog had turned his mirrors into useless decorations, and his visibility into a narrow cone of perception that ended just beyond his front bumper. 2 miles later, he encountered another stopped truck, this one on the left shoulder facing the wrong direction as if it had crossed the median and given up. The hazard lights were flashing and the engine was running, creating a plume of exhaust that mixed with the fog. Booth reported this one too, noting the unusual positioning and the fact that no driver was visible in the cab. The pattern was repeating itself, the same setup from the previous night, but this time Booth knew what he was looking for. Around mile marker 165, the voice came over the CB. It was the same strained male voice, exhausted and hollow, speaking with the same deliberate cadence that Booth remembered. Southbound at marker 165. They're setting up tonight. 4 trucks as bait, 2 teams working the corridor. Don't stop for anything. Don't trust the lights. Booth's heart rate spiked. The voice was back, providing the same kind of warnings, confirming that tonight was another active operation. He grabbed his microphone, determined to establish contact this time. This is Booth Ellery, southbound at marker 168. I copy your transmission. Who am I talking to? What's your position? Static filled the channel for several seconds, then the voice returned. Quieter now, almost a whisper. You shouldn't be out here tonight. You got away last time. They'll recognize your truck. They'll know you're looking for them. I'm trying to help, Booth said. I've been documenting the fake signs and the abandoned trucks. I've talked to people who've seen the pattern. If you can give me more information, I can take it to the authorities and stop this. Another long pause. When the voice came back, it carried a weight of sadness that made Booth's chest tighten. The authorities can't stop them. They've been doing this for 3 years. They're too careful, too mobile. By the time anyone investigates, they're gone. The trucks are gone. The evidence is gone. All that's left are the disappeared. Are you one of them? Booth asked. One of the drivers who disappeared? The static seemed to pulse, as if the speaker was struggling with whether to answer. Finally, the voice returned. I was. 6 months ago near Delano. They used the same setup you saw, fake signs and empty trucks. I stopped to help what I thought was a stranded driver. That was my mistake. Booth felt his stomach drop. He was talking to one of the missing drivers, someone who had been captured and was presumably still being held somewhere in the valley. Where are you now? Can you tell me your location? I can call for help. Location changes. They move us every few days. Right now, we're in an old processing facility east of the highway, but by tomorrow we'll be somewhere else. That's how they stay ahead of the investigators. Nothing stays in one place long enough to be found. Patricia's voice cut into the channel. This is Patricia monitoring from 41. Booth, I'm hearing this transmission. Can you confirm you're safe? Safe for now, Booth replied. But I need to keep this channel open. The voice is giving me information. The strained voice came back, and this time there was urgency in the tone. You need to listen carefully. They know you're out here tonight. They've been monitoring CB traffic and they heard you asking questions at the rest area. There's a trap being set at mile marker 158. Don't take the Goshen Avenue exit. The signs have been moved. The real exit is blocked. If you follow the signs, you'll end up on a farm road that dead ends at their processing facility. Booth checked his GPS. He was at mile marker 163, which meant Goshen Avenue was 5 miles ahead. He had been planning to take that exit to turn around and head back north toward the Pixley rest area. If the voice was correct, and Booth had no reason to doubt it, driving through that exit would deliver him directly into the hands of the people who had been setting traps for drivers. "Copy that," Booth said. "I'll stay on the main highway, but I need more information. How many people are involved in this operation? What are they doing with the drivers they capture?" The voice hesitated, and Booth could hear breathing on the other end of the transmission, ragged and shallow. 8 people in the main crew. Maybe more on the periphery. They're not just hijacking trucks. That's part of it, but there's something else. They're collecting us. The drivers they take. They keep us alive, keep us working. We monitor CB traffic, identify high-value targets, help set up the traps. If we refuse or try to escape, they kill us. I've seen it happen twice. The horror of what Booth was hearing cut through the fog and the fear. These weren't just hijackers or thieves. They were slavers, capturing truck drivers and forcing them to participate in an operation that would claim more victims. The voice he was talking to belonged to someone who had been broken down, stripped of agency, turned into a tool for the same people who had destroyed his life. "How many drivers are with you?" Booth asked. "How many people are being held?" "4 of us right now. There used to be more, but..." The voice trailed off and the implication was clear. "They keep the ones who are useful, the ones who know the highways and understand how truckers think. The rest, they don't last long." Booth was approaching mile marker 160, and he could see lights ahead in the fog. Multiple vehicles positioned on both shoulders, creating a gauntlet that any driver would have to pass through. His instinct was to slow down, to assess the situation before committing. But the voice had warned him about mile marker 158, and he was rapidly running out of highway. "There's a blockage ahead," Booth reported on the CB. "Multiple vehicles at marker 160. Can anyone confirm what we're looking at?" No response came from other drivers. The channel was silent except for the steady hiss of static. Booth realized with growing dread that he might be the only truck on this section of highway, isolated by the fog and the late hour. The vehicles ahead could be legitimate breakdown situations, or they could be part of the trap the voice had warned him about. The strained voice cut through his thoughts. "Those are theirs. They're boxing you in. You need to take the next crossover and head north. It's not an official turnaround, but it's paved and marked. Do it now before you reach the blockage." Booth saw the crossover opening up on his left, a gap in the median barrier that emergency vehicles use to reverse direction. It wasn't legal for commercial trucks to use these crossovers, but the alternative was driving into whatever trap had been set at mile marker 160. He made his decision in the space of a heartbeat, cranking his wheel left and guiding his truck through the opening. The maneuver was harder than it should have been. The crossover was designed for smaller vehicles, and Booth's trailer scraped against the concrete barriers on both sides as he forced his way through. Metal screamed and sparks flew, visible even in the dense fog. But he made it through and accelerated north in the southbound lanes, hoping desperately that no other vehicles were coming toward him in the fog. His CB erupted with voices. Multiple people were shouting at once, some demanding to know why he was driving the wrong way, others warning about the dangerous maneuver. Booth ignored them all and focused on getting distance between himself and the trap he had just avoided. In his mirrors, he could see lights moving behind him, vehicles pulling onto the highway and accelerating to follow. They weren't even trying to hide anymore. "They're coming after you," the strained voice confirmed. 3 vehicles. They're going to try to force you off the road or block you in. You need to reach the way station at marker 178. There are CHP officers on duty tonight because of the fog. That's your only safe destination. Booth checked his GPS. The way station was 18 miles away. which meant nearly 40 minutes of driving at his current speed in these conditions. The vehicles behind him were gaining, their more powerful engines and lighter weights giving them an advantage over his loaded truck. He could see their headlights growing brighter in his mirrors, closing the distance with methodical precision. Patricia's voice cut through the chaos on the CB. "Booth, I'm trying to reach CHP dispatch, but I'm not getting through. The fog is interfering with cell signals. You need to know that you're on your own until you reach that way station." Booth acknowledged and pushed his truck harder, increasing speed to 40 miles per hour despite the terrible visibility. It was dangerous, bordering on suicidal, but staying slow meant getting caught. He kept one eye on the white line, marking the edge of his lane, and the other on his mirrors, watching the pursuing vehicles grow closer with each passing second. The strained voice came back, and this time there was something different in the tone. Desperation mixed with determination. "I'm going to try to slow them down. I have limited access, but I can do something. Just keep driving north. Don't stop. Don't look back." Before Booth could ask what the voice meant, his CB filled with new transmissions. It was the same voice, but now it was giving false information to the pursuing vehicles. "Target truck is pulling over at marker 170. Repeat, target is stopping at marker 170 southbound side. Converge on that position." Booth was nowhere near mile marker 170. He was passing marker 172 northbound, and if the false information worked, the pursuers would waste precious time searching the wrong location. It was a brilliant piece of misdirection, and it bought Booth the minutes he desperately needed. The headlights in his mirrors fell back as the pursuing vehicles apparently took the exit at marker 170, searching for a truck that wasn't there. Booth kept driving, kept pushing north through the fog, his hands aching from gripping the wheel so tightly. His entire world had contracted to the strip of highway visible in his fog lamps and the voices crackling over his CB radio. Around mile marker 180, he saw the lights of the way station ahead. They were bright and official, cutting through the fog with the unmistakable presence of law enforcement. Booth had never been so relieved to see a mandatory inspection point in his life. He pulled onto the scale and shut off his engine, his hands shaking as the adrenaline drained from his system. A California Highway Patrol officer approached his truck, flashlight in hand, and Booth rolled down his window to meet him. The officer's expression was stern but concerned. "You the driver who came through the median crossover about 20 miles back. We had multiple reports of a truck driving northbound in the southbound lanes." "Yes, sir," Booth said. "I had good reason. There are people setting traps for truckers in the fog. I have information about missing drivers in a criminal operation that's been running for 3 years. The officer's expression shifted from stern to alert. "I need you to park your truck and come inside. We're going to need a detailed statement." Booth parked and followed the officer into the way station office, where 3 more CHP officers were monitoring the highway conditions. He spent the next 2 hours telling them everything he knew: the fake exit signs, the empty trucks used as bait, the voice on the CB that had warned him and provided information. He showed them the photos of Mirren's map and log, played the recorded CB transmissions from his radio, and described the vehicles that had pursued him through the fog. The officers listened with increasing gravity, taking notes and making calls to their superiors. One of them confirmed that they had been receiving reports of suspicious activity on Highway 99 for months, but had never been able to find concrete evidence. The fog made investigation nearly impossible, and by the time officers arrived at reported locations, any evidence had vanished. "The voice on the CB," one of the officers said, "the one claiming to be a captured driver. Did he give you any identifying information? A name? A physical description? Anything we could use to confirm his identity?" Booth shook his head. He said there were 4 drivers being held, and that they moved locations every few days. He mentioned an old processing facility east of the highway, but that could be anywhere in a 50-mile radius. Another officer was studying Mirren's map, comparing it to his own charts of the area. These locations match several abandoned agricultural facilities we know about. Most of them are owned by defunct companies or absentee landlords. They'd be perfect for temporary operations that need to stay mobile and avoid detection. As the officers continued their discussion, Booth stepped outside to call Patricia and Myron, updating them on his situation. Patricia was relieved to hear he had made it to safety and promised to meet him at the way station. Myron reported that she had seen unusual vehicle activity near the rest area around the time Booth was being pursued, including several trucks and SUVs that had pulled in briefly before leaving again without their drivers using the facilities. Booth stood in the parking lot of the way station, watching the fog swirl in the lights, and tried to process everything that had happened. He had been chased through the fog by criminals who had perfected the art of preying on truckers. He had been saved by a voice on the CB, a fellow driver who was being held captive and forced to participate in the same operation that had destroyed his life. And despite his best efforts to gather evidence and report the situation to authorities, the operation would probably continue. The criminals would relocate, adapt their tactics, and wait for the next foggy night to resume their hunting. The weight of that knowledge settled on Booth like a physical burden. How many more drivers would disappear before someone stopped these people? How many more voices would cry out warnings over CB Channel 19, trying to save strangers from their own fate? Patricia arrived about an hour later, parking her truck next to Booth's and joining him in the way station office. The CHP officers were preparing to conduct a sweep of the area, focusing on the abandoned processing facilities marked on Myron's map. They were coordinating with other agencies, bringing in resources that might actually make a difference. But everyone in the room understood that the fog was the enemy's greatest ally, and by morning, when visibility returned, the operation would have disappeared again. Around midnight, one of the officers received a call that made everyone in the room fall silent. A record driver named Thad Pennington had reported finding an abandoned truck on County Road J22, the same exit that had been marked with fake signs the previous night. The truck was registered to one of the drivers who had been reported missing 6 weeks ago, the one from Nevada. It was positioned exactly as Booth had described the bait trucks, engine running and hazard lights flashing. But this time there was something different. There was a note taped to the steering wheel. The officer read it aloud, and Booth felt his blood run cold. The note was handwritten in shaky letters, as if the writer's hand had been trembling or injured. It said, "4 of us still alive. We tried to help. They're moving us tonight because of the attention. If you find this, tell our families we didn't abandon them. Tell them we fought." The note was signed with 4 names. Booth recognized one of them from the news articles he had read about missing drivers. The officer who had been tracking the cases recognized 2 others. The 4th name was unfamiliar, possibly someone whose disappearance had never been officially reported. "This confirms what Booth told us," the senior officer said. "We're not dealing with simple hijacking. This is organized human trafficking, forced labor, possibly worse. I'm calling in every available unit and requesting support from the FBI. We need to find these people before they move their base of operations." The officers mobilized quickly, coordinating a response that involved multiple agencies and dozens of personnel. But Booth knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that they were already too late. The voice on the CB had said they were moving because of the attention. By the time the sweep teams reached the abandoned processing facilities, the criminals and their captives would be gone, relocated to another corner of the valley where they could continue their operation. Patricia stood next to Booth at the window, watching the fog that showed no signs of lifting. "Do you think they'll find them?" she asked quietly. "No," Booth said. Not tonight, maybe not ever. They've been doing this for 3 years and they're good at staying invisible. The fog is their cover, and there's too much territory to search, too many places to hide. So, what do we do? Booth thought about the voice on the CB, about the desperate note left in the abandoned truck, about the families waiting for answers that might never come. We keep driving, he said. We keep monitoring the CB channels. We keep documenting the fake signs and the suspicious vehicles. And we make sure that every driver who works this valley knows what to look for and what to avoid. Maybe we can't stop them directly, but we can make it harder for them to find victims. The CHP officers departed shortly after 1 in the morning, leaving Booth and Patricia alone in the way station parking lot with instructions to stay put until the fog lifted. They sat in Patricia's truck with the heater running, drinking coffee from a thermos and talking about the night's events in low voices. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and somewhere out there in the darkness, 4 captured drivers were being moved to a new location where they would continue their forced participation in an operation that fed on fear and isolation. Around 3 in the morning, Booth's CB crackled to life one final time. It was the strained voice, barely audible through heavy static. "Thank you for trying. We're being moved now. I don't know if I'll have access to a radio after tonight. If you're listening, if anyone is listening, remember us. Remember that we didn't stop trying to help. Even when we couldn't save ourselves, we tried to save you." The transmission ended with a burst of static, and despite Booth's repeated attempts to raise the speaker, there was no response. The channel returned to its normal background noise, and the voice that had guided him through the fog fell silent. Booth sat with the microphone in his hand, staring at the radio, wanting desperately to say something that would matter, something that would reach through the distance and the darkness to let those captive drivers know they hadn't been forgotten. But what could he say? What words would comfort someone trapped in a nightmare with no clear path to freedom? In the end, Booth simply keyed the microphone and spoke into the void. "We hear you. We remember you. And we won't stop looking." The fog began to lift as dawn approached, revealing a landscape that looked innocent and ordinary in the growing light. Highway 99 stretched north and south like a ribbon of gray asphalt, and the agricultural fields spread out in every direction under a clear sky. There was no sign of the terror that had unfolded during the night, no indication that people were being held captive somewhere in those fields, no evidence of the traps that had been set and the drivers who had nearly fallen into them. The CHP officers returned to the way station around 6 in the morning with their report. They had searched 12 abandoned facilities and found evidence of recent occupation at 3 of them. Tire tracks, discarded food containers, signs that vehicles had been parked and people had been present. But no trucks, no captives, no criminals. Everything of value had been moved or destroyed, leaving behind only the faint traces of an operation that had learned how to disappear without leaving evidence. One of the officers pulled Booth aside as he was preparing to leave. "We're treating this as an active investigation now. Your statement and the note we found are enough to justify federal involvement. But I need to warn you about something. These people know who you are. They've seen your truck and they've heard you on the CB asking questions. If they perceive you as a threat to their operation, they might come after you directly." Booth had already considered that possibility. "What do you suggest I do?" "Change your routes if possible. Avoid Highway 99 during fog conditions. Keep your CB recordings backed up and send copies to us regularly. And if you see anything suspicious, anything at all, don't try to investigate it yourself. Call us immediately." Booth agreed to follow the officer's advice, though he knew that changing routes wouldn't make him safe. These people had been operating for 3 years. adapting and surviving despite occasional attention from law enforcement. They were patient and careful, and if they wanted to find him, they would find him. The only question was whether Booth's value as a witness outweighed the risk of eliminating him. Patricia walked with Booth back to his truck as the sun climbed higher and burned away the last remnants of fog. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. "Deliver my load, go home, hug my wife and kids. Then I'm going to start making calls to every trucking organization and driver advocacy group I can find. This story needs to be told, and drivers need to know what's happening out here. They might not believe you. Hell, I was there and I'm still processing it. Some will believe that's enough. Even if we save one driver by spreading the word about fake signs and bait trucks, it's worth it." Patricia nodded and offered her hand. Booth shook it, recognizing the gesture for what it was: a pact between drivers who had seen something most people would never believe, and who were committed to making sure it couldn't be ignored or forgotten. Booth climbed into his truck and started the engine, checking his mirrors and his lights and his CB radio one last time. The highway ahead was clear, and the day was bright, offering no hint of the white tunnels and blind spots that would return with the next fog. He pulled onto Highway 99, heading north toward Modesto, toward the completion of his delivery and the temporary safety of daylight and visibility. But as he drove, Booth couldn't stop thinking about the 4 names signed on that note. 4 drivers who had been trying to help, who had used the only tool available to them, a CB radio and knowledge of the highway, to warn strangers and sabotage the operation that held them captive. 4 people who were now being moved to a new location where they might never be found. The Thule fog would return tonight and tomorrow night, and every night through the winter months. And somewhere in the valley, hidden among the abandoned facilities and empty fields, an operation would continue to hunt for drivers who stopped to help or followed fake signs or made the small mistakes that turned routine trips into disappearances. Booth had survived 2 encounters with them, but he knew his luck wouldn't hold forever. The question wasn't whether he would encounter them again. The question was whether next time, when the fog descended and the white tunnel closed around him, he would be able to escape. Or whether he would become another voice on the CB radio, strained and hollow, warning strangers about traps while trapped himself in a nightmare that had no clear ending. Mile marker 200 appeared in his windshield, then 205, then 210. The highway stretched ahead, familiar and treacherous, and Booth Ellery kept driving through the bright morning light, knowing that darkness was only 12 hours away. 3 weeks passed before Booth drove Highway 99 again. He had taken alternate routes through those weeks, adding hours to his trips but avoiding the Central Valley corridor where fog still descended every night like clockwork. His company hadn't questioned the route changes, and his dispatcher seemed content to let him work around whatever psychological aftermath he was dealing with. The official investigation into the trafficking operation had gone quiet after the initial sweep turned up nothing but empty buildings and tire tracks that led nowhere. The FBI had interviewed Booth twice, taking detailed statements and collecting his CB recordings. They had confirmed the identities of 3 of the 4 names on the note found in the abandoned truck. All 3 were drivers who had been reported missing over the past 8 months, and all 3 had last been seen on Highway 99 during foggy conditions. The 4th name remained unidentified, belonging to someone who either hadn't been reported missing or whose disappearance had been attributed to other causes. The families of the confirmed victims had been notified that their loved ones might still be alive, though the agents were careful not to offer false hope about rescue or recovery. Booth had kept his promise to Patricia. He had reached out to trucking organizations and driver advocacy groups, sharing his story and warning other drivers about the tactics being used to target them. Some had listened with interest, others with skepticism. A few online forums had picked up the story, generating discussion threads that mixed genuine concern with conspiracy theories and accusations that Booth was making it all up for attention. He had stopped reading the comments after someone suggested he was working with the traffickers to create fear and manipulate drivers. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in early December. Booth's dispatcher called with an urgent load, high-value electronics that needed to move from Sacramento to Bakersfield with a tight delivery window. The only viable route was Highway 99 straight through the heart of the valley. The weather forecast showed clear conditions and no fog advisory. It should have been a routine run, the kind Booth had completed hundreds of times over his 11-year career. He accepted the load because he needed the work and because he couldn't spend the rest of his life avoiding a highway out of fear. But as he pulled out of the Sacramento warehouse and pointed his truck south, Booth felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had become his constant companion since that night in the fog. Every exit sign made him look twice to confirm it was legitimate. Every stopped vehicle on the shoulder triggered an assessment of whether it was genuine distress or bait. The clear daylight should have been reassuring, but Booth had learned that predators didn't always hunt in darkness. The drive went smoothly through the morning hours. Traffic was moderate, the weather held, and Booth made good time past Stockton and Modesto. He stopped for fuel at the truck stop in Fresno, where he had first met Patricia, half hoping to run into her again, but finding only strangers. The place looked exactly as it had 3 weeks ago, ordinary and forgettable, giving no indication that it sat at the edge of a hunting ground. Around 2 in the afternoon, as Booth was passing through Tulare County, his CB radio crackled with a transmission that made him reach for the volume. It wasn't the strained voice he had been half expecting to hear. It was a different voice, younger and more urgent, calling for help with what sounded like genuine panic. "This is a driver at mile marker 145 southbound. My trailer just lost a tire and I'm stuck on the shoulder. I need a wrecker and I need someone to help me set up better warning triangles. Traffic is coming up on me too fast and I'm worried about getting rear-ended." Booth checked his position. He was at mile marker 152, which meant the stranded driver was about 7 miles ahead. His first instinct was to offer assistance, the same instinct that had defined his career and the culture of the highway. But the memory of empty trucks and fake distress calls held him back. He keyed his microphone with a different response. "This is Booth Ellery at marker 152. I can see your position ahead. Before I commit to stopping, can you give me your truck number and company name? I want to verify you're legitimate." The response came back immediately, and the caller sounded confused but willing to comply. "Sure, I'm truck 447 with West Point Freight. Company is based in Reno. I've got my hazards on, and I'm pulled as far onto the shoulder as I can get." Booth grabbed his phone and did a quick search. West Point Freight was a legitimate carrier with a good safety record. He couldn't confirm the truck number without more time, but the driver's willingness to provide identifying information suggested this was genuine. Still, he approached the situation with caution, scanning the shoulder and the surrounding area as he drew closer. The stranded truck came into view exactly where the driver had indicated. It was positioned on the shoulder with a blown trailer tire, and the driver was standing behind his truck trying to position warning triangles. The man was in his 30s, wearing a company jacket with the West Point Freight logo clearly visible. Everything about the scene appeared legitimate, but Booth's experience had taught him that appearances could be manufactured. He pulled over about 100 feet behind the stranded truck and stepped out of his cab with his phone in hand, ready to call 911 if anything felt wrong. The driver approached him with genuine relief on his face, and Booth felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. This was what it was supposed to be like. Drivers helping drivers. The basic decency of the highway that predators had turned into a weapon. "Thanks for stopping," the driver said, extending his hand. "Name's Kyle. That tire just blew out on me and I've been stuck here for 20 minutes. My company is sending a mobile service truck, but it's going to be at least an hour." Booth shook his hand and helped Kyle set up additional warning triangles and flares to make the stranded truck more visible to approaching traffic. They worked in silence for a few minutes, and then Kyle asked the question Booth had been dreading. "Hey, aren't you the driver who was on the news a few weeks back? The one who reported that trafficking thing with the fake signs?" Booth hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Yeah, that was me." Kyle's expression shifted to something between respect and concern. "Man, that must have been intense. I heard about it through the driver network. A lot of guys think you're exaggerating or making it up, but I believe you. I've driven this valley for 6 years and I've seen some weird stuff during fog season. Nothing as bad as what you described, but enough to make me nervous." "What kind of weird stuff?" Booth asked. "Empty trucks on the shoulder mostly. Hazard lights on, but nobody around. I always report them, but I never stop to check. Had a buddy who stopped to help what he thought was a broken down vehicle near Pixley last year. Turned out there were guys waiting in the bushes. They tried to rob him, but he got back in his truck and drove off. He reported it to CHP, but nothing ever came of it." Booth felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. The pattern was bigger than he had realized, extending beyond the organized operation he had encountered. Or maybe the organized operation had been running longer and affecting more people than anyone understood. "Did your buddy give a description of the guys who tried to rob him?" "Not much of one. He said they were wearing dark clothes and moved like they knew what they were doing. Professional, not just random opportunists. That's what scared him the most. How organized it seemed." They finished setting up the warning devices and Booth walked back to his truck with Kyle's story echoing in his mind. How many other drivers had encountered pieces of the operation and written them off as isolated incidents? How many close calls had there been that never got reported or investigated? The scope of the threat was impossible to measure, hidden in the fog and the vast emptiness of the valley. Booth continued south, making his delivery in Bakersfield without incident. But as he was preparing to head back north in the late afternoon, his phone rang with a number he recognized, one of the FBI agents who had interviewed him about the trafficking case. "Mr. Ellery, this is Agent Morrison. I wanted to update you on our investigation. We've made some progress, but I need to caution you that the situation is complicated." Booth pulled over in the parking lot of the distribution center and gave the agent his full attention. "What did you find?" "We identified the fourth name from the note. It belonged to a driver who disappeared in 2022, before we had any indication this operation existed. His family had assumed he abandoned them, that he'd just decided to walk away from his life. Learning that he might have been taken against his will has been difficult for them." "But you haven't found any of the captives," Booth said. It wasn't a question. "No. We've expanded the search to include abandoned facilities in 5 counties, but whoever is running this operation has gone to ground. We did find something interesting, though. At one of the facilities we searched, there was evidence of a CB radio setup that had been dismantled recently. Someone had been monitoring multiple channels and recording transmissions. We think that's how they identified targets and tracked law enforcement response." Booth thought about the voice on the CB, the captive driver who had access to a radio and had used it to warn other truckers. "The recordings, did you find any of them?" "The hard drives had been wiped, but our tech team recovered some fragments. Most of it was corrupted, but we did pull one clear transmission. It was dated 3 days after your incident. Want to hear it?" "Yes." Agent Morrison played the recording over the phone. It was brief, just 10 seconds of audio, but Booth recognized the strained voice immediately. "They're moving us north, past Stockton. I don't know if anyone can hear this. I don't know if it matters anymore, but we're still here. We're still trying." The recording ended, and Agent Morrison continued. "We've increased patrols in the Stockton area, and we're investigating facilities north of there. But I need to be honest with you, Mr. Ellery. These people are sophisticated, and they have resources we don't fully understand. They might be part of a larger network that extends beyond California. This could take months or years to fully unravel. What about the drivers who are being held? How long can they survive in those conditions? The silence on the other end of the line told Booth everything he needed to know. Agent Morrison's voice was gentle when he finally responded. We're doing everything we can, but you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that by the time we locate them, it might be too late. Booth ended the call and sat in his truck watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The sky was clear now, but he knew that would change after dark. The fog would roll in as it always did, transforming the valley into that maze of white tunnels and blind spots. And somewhere in that fog, 4 drivers would be monitoring CB channels and warning strangers about traps, while trapped themselves in a situation that grew more desperate with each passing day. The drive back to Sacramento took 4 hours, and Booth spent most of it monitoring Channel 19 on his CB. He heard the usual traffic, position reports, weather complaints, warnings about speed traps. But underneath the routine chatter, he found himself listening for something else. A strained voice offering cryptic warnings. A pattern in the noise that might indicate someone trying to communicate despite being monitored by their captors. He heard nothing unusual. The channel stayed routine and ordinary all the way to Sacramento, and Booth tried to tell himself that was a good sign. Maybe the FBI's increased attention had forced the operation to shut down communication. Maybe the captive drivers had been moved to a location where they no longer had access to radios. Maybe, against all odds, they had found a way to escape. But Booth knew better than to believe in convenient endings. The operation had survived for 3 years by being careful and adaptable. They wouldn't shut down completely just because of one investigation. They would wait, adjust their tactics, and resume operations when they felt secure enough. The fog would always return, and with it, the opportunity to hunt. Booth reached his home in Billings just after midnight and sat in his driveway for several minutes before going inside. His wife had left the porch light on, and he could see the warm glow of interior lights through the windows. It was ordinary and safe, and exactly what he needed after 3 weeks of hypervigilance and paranoia. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was betraying the captive drivers by returning to normalcy while they remained trapped. Over the next 2 weeks, Booth fell back into his regular routine with modifications. He avoided Highway 99 whenever possible, taking alternate routes that added time and fuel costs to his trips. He kept his CB recordings backed up and sent weekly updates to Agent Morrison, though he had nothing new to report. The fog season continued through December and into January, and the valley remained quiet. No new reports of missing drivers, no suspicious vehicles, no warning voices on the CB. The silence should have been reassuring, but it felt ominous. Booth couldn't shake the conviction that the operation hadn't stopped. It had just become more careful. Maybe they had identified him as too dangerous to target. Maybe they had shifted their focus to drivers who wouldn't recognize the warning signs. Maybe they had moved to a different highway entirely, taking their tactics to some other fog-shrouded corridor where drivers would be just as vulnerable. On a gray morning in mid-January, Booth's phone rang with a call from Thad Pennington, the record driver who had found the abandoned truck with the note. They had spoken twice since the initial incident, comparing observations and sharing information that might help the investigation. "I found something," Thad said without preamble. Another truck, same setup as before, abandoned on County Road J22, engine running, no driver. But this time there was something different. Someone spray-painted a message on the side of the trailer. Booth felt his pulse quicken. What did it say? Its coordinates, latitude and longitude. I already gave them to the FBI, but I wanted you to know too. They're planning a raid tonight." "Where do the coordinates point to?" "An old tomato processing plant about 15 miles east of Delano. The property has been abandoned since 2019, and it's owned by a shell company that traces back to a larger corporate structure. The FBI thinks it might be the current base of operations." Booth asked Thad to send him the coordinates and spent the rest of the day watching the clock and checking his phone for updates. Agent Morrison called around 5 in the evening to inform him that the raid was moving forward with a multi-agency team. They had surveillance in place and had confirmed activity at the site. Multiple vehicles, evidence of occupation, signs that people were being held against their will. "We're going in at 2200 hours, Morrison said. "I can't give you details over the phone, but I wanted you to know that your testimony and evidence made this possible. Whatever we find tonight, good or bad, it's because you had the courage to speak up." Booth thanked him and ended the call, then spent the next 4 hours pacing his living room and refreshing the news on his phone. His wife asked what was wrong, and he gave her a simplified version. There was a police operation related to the highway incident, and he was waiting to hear the outcome. She didn't press for details, recognizing the tension in his posture and the distraction in his eyes. The first news alert came through at 10:47 p.m. FBI conducts raid on Central Valley facility in human trafficking investigation. The details were sparse. Multiple agencies involved. Operation ongoing. No information yet on casualties or arrests. Booth read the article 3 times, searching for any hint of what they had found, but the information was being carefully controlled. Agent Morrison called at 11:30 p.m. His voice was tired, but there was an undercurrent of satisfaction. "We found them. All 4 drivers from the note. They're alive, though they're in rough shape. Medical teams are transporting them to hospitals now. We also arrested 6 people at the site, and we're tracking down at least 4 more who weren't present during the raid." Booth felt his knees weaken, and he sat down hard on his couch. "The drivers, are they going to be okay?" "Physically, most of their injuries are treatable. Psychologically, they've been through hell. It's going to take a long time for them to recover, if they ever fully do. But they're alive and they're free, and that's more than we hoped for 2 hours ago." "Did they say anything about what happened? About how they survived?" Morrison paused before responding. "One of them, the driver who was captured 6 months ago, he told us something interesting. He said they took turns on the CB radio, warning other drivers whenever they had the chance. It was the only way they could fight back. The only way they felt like they hadn't completely lost their humanity. He asked me to thank you specifically. He said you were the first driver who listened and survived, and that gave them hope they could actually make a difference." Booth's throat tightened, and he had to wait several seconds before he could speak. "What was his name?" "I can't share that right now, but he'll probably want to talk to you once he's recovered. They all will, I imagine. You're part of their story now, whether you intended to be or not." The call ended, and Booth sat in his living room long into the night, processing the news. 4 men had been rescued from a situation that could have killed them. 6 criminals had been arrested and more were being hunted. The operation that had terrorized the Central Valley for 3 years had been exposed and dismantled. It should have felt like a victory, like justice being served. But Booth couldn't stop thinking about the drivers who hadn't been rescued. The ones who had disappeared before the note was written, before anyone understood the scope of the operation. The FBI had found evidence at the site suggesting there had been other captives who were no longer present. Their fates uncertain and possibly permanent. The tomato processing plant had yielded documentation of the operation's tactics and targets, but it had also revealed gaps in the timeline, periods when the operation had been even more active than anyone suspected. The news coverage over the next few days provided more details. The arrested individuals were being charged with kidnapping, human trafficking, forced labor, and multiple counts of assault. The rescued drivers were recovering in protective custody, their identities withheld from the public to shield them from media attention and potential retaliation. The FBI had seized computers and records that suggested the operation had been moving drivers around like inventory, keeping them drugged and compliant, using them as tools to identify and capture additional targets. One detail stood out in the reporting. The operation had been funded by selling the hijacked trucks and their cargo, but that wasn't the primary motivation. According to law enforcement sources, the ringleaders appeared to have been engaged in a form of human experimentation, testing how long they could keep professional drivers functional under various conditions of stress and deprivation. The rescued drivers had been subjected to psychological manipulation, designed to break down their sense of identity and make them compliant participants in the operation. Booth read the articles with growing horror, understanding that what he had escaped wasn't just criminal enterprise but something closer to torture and human experimentation. The strained quality of the voice on the CB made terrible sense now. It wasn't just exhaustion or injury. It was the voice of someone who had been systematically broken down and rebuilt as a tool. 2 weeks after the raid, Booth received a letter forwarded through Agent Morrison. It was from one of the rescued drivers, a man who asked to remain anonymous but wanted Booth to know what his actions had meant. The letter was handwritten in shaky script that suggested the writer's hand still trembled from trauma. "You don't know me, but I know your voice. I was the one on the CB radio that night when you drove through the fog. I was the one warning you about the fake signs and the followers. They had me monitoring the channels looking for high-value targets, but when I heard you asking questions and refusing to follow the signs, I knew you were different. I knew you were looking for us. I took a risk warning you. They beat me when they found out I'd been interfering with the operation. But it was worth it because you survived and you told our story. You made people listen, and because of that we were found. I don't know if I'll ever be able to drive again. The thought of sitting in a truck cab makes me physically ill. But I'm alive and I'm free, and my family knows I didn't abandon them. That's more than I thought I'd ever have 3 weeks ago when they moved us to that processing plant. The FBI told me you asked about the other drivers, the ones from before we were captured. I don't have good news. We saw evidence that there were others before us, but they didn't survive. The operation got more sophisticated over time, learned how to keep people alive longer and more compliant. We were the first group they managed to keep functional for more than a few months. I'm telling you this not to traumatize you, but because you deserve to know the truth. What you stumbled into wasn't just a hijacking operation. It was something darker, run by people who saw drivers as resources to be exploited and discarded. You stopped it from continuing. You saved not just the 4 of us, but everyone who would have been captured after us. Thank you for listening to a stranger's voice in the fog. Thank you for not dismissing the warnings as paranoia or interference. Thank you for being the kind of person who tries to help even when it's dangerous. The highway needs more drivers like you. The letter was unsigned, but Booth kept it in his truck, tucked into the pocket behind his sun visor. He read it whenever he felt the weight of what he'd experienced becoming too heavy, whenever he questioned whether speaking up had been worth the disruption to his life and career. The Central Valley fog season continued through February and into March, gradually tapering off as spring approached. Booth resumed driving Highway 99 on a limited basis, though he never worked the route at night, and he avoided foggy conditions entirely. The highway looked different to him now. No longer just a ribbon of asphalt connecting cities, but a hunting ground where predators had learned to use weather and isolation as weapons. He saw Patricia one more time, by chance at a truck stop in Fresno. They had coffee together and compared notes on their respective recoveries from the incident. Patricia had also been interviewed by the FBI and had provided her CB recordings as evidence. She told Booth that she'd been driving the valley for 24 years and would probably continue for another 10, but she would never look at fog the same way again. "The thing that bothers me most," Patricia said, "is wondering how long it was going on before anyone noticed. 3 years officially, but what if it was longer? What if there were other operations like this one on other highways? We assume the road is safe because we've driven it 1,000 times, but all it takes is one group of people who figure out how to exploit our assumptions, and suddenly nowhere is safe." Booth had thought the same thing many times. The arrested ringleaders had been interrogated and had revealed connections to similar operations in Nevada and Oregon, though none as sophisticated or long-running as the Central Valley setup. The FBI was investigating, but had cautioned that prosecuting interstate trafficking operations was complex and time-consuming. It might be years before the full scope of the network was understood. Mirren O'Keefe continued working at the Pixley Rest Area, and Booth stopped there occasionally to check in with her. She had been interviewed by multiple law enforcement agencies, and her log had become key evidence in the prosecution. She told Booth that she felt validated but also haunted, knowing that she had been documenting evidence of crimes while they were happening and hadn't been able to stop them. "I kept reporting those empty trucks," she said, "every single time I saw one. But nobody took it seriously until you put all the pieces together and gave them a story they couldn't ignore. I just wish I'd done more, been more persistent, made them listen earlier." Booth understood the guilt. He carried his own version of it, the wondering about whether he could have acted sooner, whether his initial reports to the Highway Patrol should have been more forceful, whether there was something he could have done differently that might have led to the rescue happening weeks earlier. But Agent Morrison had told him something that helped put it in perspective. Criminal operations like this survive because they're designed to exploit the normal functioning of society. They use our infrastructure, our communication systems, our weather patterns as cover. The fact that it took 3 years to catch them doesn't mean people weren't paying attention. It means the criminals were very good at staying invisible. You broke the invisibility, and that's what mattered. 4 months after the raid, Booth received an invitation to meet with the rescued drivers who felt ready to have the conversation. The meeting was arranged through the FBI and took place at a neutral location, a conference room in a Sacramento office building. 3 of the 4 drivers attended. The 4th was still in intensive psychological treatment and wasn't ready for public interaction. Booth sat across from 3 men whose faces showed the marks of their ordeal: weight loss, premature aging, a haunted quality in their eyes that suggested they still hadn't fully escaped the processing plant. They introduced themselves with their real names and shared abbreviated versions of their stories. Each had been captured using slightly different tactics, but the pattern was consistent: fake signs, empty trucks as bait, and rapid incapacitation once they stopped to help. The driver who had written the letter, whose name was Marcus, did most of the talking. "We wanted to meet you face to face because the CB radio was all we had for so long. Voices without faces, helping each other without knowing if any of it mattered. Now we can put faces to the voices, and that makes it feel more real somehow." They talked for 2 hours, comparing their experiences and filling in details that helped Booth understand the full picture of the operation. The criminals had been former truck drivers themselves, which explained their intimate knowledge of highway culture and driver psychology. They had identified the fog season as the perfect cover for their activities and had spent years refining their tactics. The fake signs were professionally made using stolen highway department equipment. The empty trucks were stolen vehicles that had been altered to be easily movable and quickly abandoned. "The thing that kept us going," Marcus said, "was knowing that we might be able to save someone even if we couldn't save ourselves." Every time we warned a driver and they listened, every time someone reported seeing our note or our graffiti, we felt like we were still human, like we still mattered. As the meeting wrapped up, one of the other rescued drivers, a man named Terrence, who had been captured near Pixley, asked Booth a question that cut to the heart of everything. "Are you going to keep driving the valley? After everything you saw and everything that happened?" Booth had been asking himself the same question for months. "Yes," he said finally. "Because if people like us stop driving out of fear, then they win. The highway is our workplace and our livelihood. We can't let criminals turn it into a place we're afraid to go. Even in the fog." Booth hesitated before answering honestly. "I don't know yet, maybe eventually. But for now, I'm staying away from fog conditions. I've earned the right to be cautious." They all agreed with that assessment. None of the rescued drivers planned to return to trucking, at least not for the foreseeable future. The trauma had been too severe, the association between trucks and captivity too strong. But they understood why Booth would continue, why he needed to prove to himself that he could reclaim the career and the highway that had been turned into a source of fear. The fog season ended officially in late March, and Booth drove Highway 99 through the spring and summer without incident. The criminal trial began in June and was expected to last months, with dozens of charges being prosecuted against the 6 arrested individuals and 4 others who had been captured in subsequent raids. Booth was scheduled to testify about his experiences and his CB recordings, and he had already started preparing his statement with the help of the prosecutor's office. But as autumn approached and the fog season loomed again, Booth found himself thinking more frequently about that voice on the CB. The strained tone, the desperate warnings, the statement, "I'll try to help," that had saved his life. Marcus had confirmed he was that voice. But there was something that didn't quite fit. The recordings Booth had made showed transmissions over a period of months, some dating back before Marcus was captured. Someone else had been warning drivers before Marcus, someone whose fate remained unknown. Booth raised this discrepancy with Agent Morrison during a phone call in September. The agent was silent for several seconds before responding. "We found evidence at the processing plant suggesting there were at least 3 other captive drivers before the group we rescued. We don't know what happened to them, and the arrested individuals aren't talking about it. But based on the timeline, it's possible one of them was the original voice you heard. Is there any way to find out? We're working on it. But I need to be honest with you. The evidence suggests those earlier captives didn't survive long enough to be rescued. The operation was more brutal in its early stages, before they learned how to keep people compliant without killing them." Booth absorbed this information and felt the familiar weight settle back on his shoulders. Someone had died trying to warn drivers, had used their last access to a CB radio to save strangers from the same fate. That person's identity might never be known, their sacrifice never properly acknowledged. They had become a ghost voice on Channel 19, an anonymous guardian angel whose warnings had evolved into a pattern that Marcus and the others had continued. When November arrived and the first fog advisories appeared on the weather forecast, Booth made a decision. He would drive Highway 99 on a foggy night, not because he had to, but because he needed to prove to himself that he could face the fear and reclaim the highway. He told his wife what he planned, and she understood, though she insisted he take extra precautions and check in every 30 minutes. The fog rolled in on a Thursday night, dense and encompassing, transforming the valley into that familiar white tunnel. Booth drove south from Sacramento with his CB on Channel 19, listening to the chatter of other drivers navigating the conditions. He passed the exits where he had seen fake signs, the rest areas where empty trucks had been positioned, the mile markers that had been engraved in his memory during those 2 terrifying nights. Everything looked normal. The signs were in their proper locations. The exits led where they were supposed to lead, and the few stopped vehicles he saw appeared to be legitimate breakdowns with drivers standing beside them. The operation had been shut down, and the valley was just a highway again. Dangerous because of limited visibility, but not because of human predators waiting in the fog. Around mile marker 165, Booth keyed his CB microphone and spoke into the channel. "This is Booth Ellery southbound at marker 165. For anyone who's monitoring this channel, remember to trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. Don't stop for suspicious vehicles and don't follow signs that don't match your GPS. Stay safe out there." He released the microphone and continued driving, feeling lighter somehow, as if he had completed a ritual that released him from the grip of trauma. The fog was just fog again, meteorological phenomenon rather than supernatural threat. The highway was just a highway, miles of asphalt connecting cities and carrying commerce. But as he approached mile marker 158, his CB crackled with a transmission that made his hands tighten on the wheel. It was a voice he had never heard before, younger than Marcus's voice but with the same strained quality, the same hollow tone that suggested someone fighting exhaustion or injury. The message was brief and cryptic. "Copy that, Booth Ellery. Message received. Some of us are still out here, still trying to help. The operation you stopped wasn't the only one. Stay alert, trust your instincts, and thank you for remembering." The transmission ended before Booth could respond. He tried calling back, tried raising the speaker on multiple channels, but there was no response. He checked his CB recorder and confirmed that the transmission had been captured, proving he hadn't imagined it. But the voice remained unidentified, and the message's meaning remained ambiguous. Booth drove the rest of the road in silence, his mind racing through possibilities. Had there been a survivor from the earlier captives who had somehow escaped and was still monitoring the highways? Was there another operation running that law enforcement hadn't discovered yet? Or had the message been something else entirely? A ghost voice from the fog that existed only in the liminal space between trauma and recovery? He reported the transmission to Agent Morrison the next morning and was told they would investigate. But Booth knew that investigation would likely lead nowhere, just as the earlier investigations had found only fragments and traces of something larger that couldn't be fully captured or understood. The highway held secrets that would never be completely revealed, and the fog would always carry voices that couldn't be easily explained. Booth continued driving the Central Valley corridor through that winter and into the next spring. He heard no more mysterious transmissions on his CB, encountered no more fake signs or suspicious vehicles. The criminal trials concluded with lengthy prison sentences for all convicted defendants, and the rescued drivers began the slow process of rebuilding their lives away from the highway. Mirren O'Keefe retired from her position at the rest area and moved to a different part of California where fog was rare and highways felt less haunted. But every time the fog descended on Highway 99, every time visibility dropped to near zero and the white tunnel enclosed the highway, Booth found himself listening to Channel 19 with extra attention. Listening for voices that shouldn't be there, for warnings that came from people who had no reason to care about strangers. Listening for evidence that somewhere in the vast network of American highways, there were still people fighting back against the darkness in the only ways available to them. The question that haunted Booth wasn't whether the operation he had helped expose was the only one of its kind. The question was how many other operations were running on other highways in other states, exploiting weather and isolation and the basic human instinct to help people in distress. How many voices were calling for help on CB channels that nobody was monitoring closely enough to hear? How many drivers were being captured and held and forced to participate in their own exploitation? Booth had no answers to these questions, but he had learned that awareness was a form of resistance. that paying attention and questioning assumptions could mean the difference between escape and capture. He shared his story whenever he had the chance, speaking at trucking conferences and driver safety meetings, making sure that the lessons he had learned in the Thule fog were passed on to others who worked the highways. And on foggy nights when the white tunnel closed around his truck and visibility dropped to nothing, Booth would key his CB microphone and speak a message into the void. A simple warning for anyone who might be listening. A reminder that the highway was beautiful and dangerous, and that survival often came down to trusting your instincts when everything else failed. This is Booth Ellery on Channel 19. If you're out there driving in the fog tonight, remember that help is available if you need it. But verify before you trust. Question before you stop. And if something feels wrong, it probably is. Stay safe, stay alert, and remember that you're not alone on the highway, even when it feels like you are. Sometimes there was no response. Sometimes other drivers would acknowledge the message with a brief "Roger" or "Copy that." But occasionally, very rarely, there would be a different kind of response. A voice that sounded tired but determined. A message that carried the weight of experience and survival. A reminder that the fight against highway predators was ongoing and would continue as long as people were willing to stay vigilant. Those were the transmissions Booth recorded and forwarded to Agent Morrison, adding to the growing database of evidence that suggested the Central Valley operation had been just one part of a larger network. And those were the transmissions that kept Booth driving, kept him monitoring the CB channels, kept him believing that his experience in the fog had meant something more than personal survival. The highway stretched ahead, fog-shrouded and mysterious, carrying commerce and danger in equal measure. And somewhere in that fog, voices continued to call out warnings and offers of help, fighting back against the darkness with the only tools they had: knowledge and awareness, and the determination to save strangers from the traps that had claimed them. Booth Ellery drove on, listening and remembering, knowing that the fog would always return and that vigilance was the price of safety. The white tunnel enclosed him like it always did, reducing his world to the space immediately ahead of his bumper. But he was no longer afraid of the fog itself. He was only afraid of what it concealed and what it enabled. And that fear kept him alert, kept him cautious, kept him alive to drive another day on the highways that connected America. The fog would lift eventually, as it always did, but the memory of voices in the darkness would remain. A reminder that survival sometimes depended on listening to warnings from people you would never meet and trusting in the basic human decency that even the worst circumstances couldn't completely destroy. Creed Moreland had been hauling freight through the Appalachian Mountains for 9 years, and he knew the backroads of West Virginia the way most people knew their own neighborhoods. The switchbacks and hairpin turns, the grades that tested your brakes and your nerves, the narrow passages where two trucks could barely squeeze past each other without scraping mirrors. He knew which roads turned to mud in spring rain and which ones became sheets of ice with the first winter freeze. He knew where the state troopers liked to set up speed traps and which gas stations stayed open past midnight when you needed fuel or coffee or just a few minutes away from the isolation of the cab. What Creed didn't know, what nobody had warned him about in 9 years of mountain driving, was what happened when the fog rolled in thick enough to erase the landscape and turn familiar roads into something unrecognizable. That lesson came on a November night when he was hauling industrial equipment from Charleston to a fabrication plant outside of Pittsburgh, taking the back roads through the mountain country because the interstate was closed for emergency bridge repairs. The fog started as a light mist around 7 in the evening, nothing unusual for mountain country in late autumn. Creed was on Route 35 heading north through the highlands, following a 2-lane road that wound through forests of oak and maple that had already lost their leaves to the season. The bare branches created a skeletal canopy overhead, and through the gaps, Creed could see the last light of day fading into purple twilight. His headlights cut through the mist without difficulty, and his GPS showed clear sailing for the next 60 miles before he would need to stop for fuel. The mist thickened gradually over the next half hour, condensing into proper fog that clung to the hollows and filled the valleys between ridges. Creed adjusted his speed and turned on his fog lamps, standard precautions for mountain driving and reduced visibility. He had driven through worse conditions and expected this to be nothing more than an inconvenience that would add 30 minutes to his trip. The road was familiar, the traffic was light, and his truck was running smoothly with fresh brakes and good tires. Around mile marker 47, Creed passed through a small community called Decker's Hollow, just a cluster of houses and a closed general store that marked one of the last settlements before the road climbed into the high country. Beyond Decker's Hollow, the pavement narrowed and the grade increased, beginning the series of switchbacks that would take him up and over Laurel Ridge. He had driven this section hundreds of times and could navigate it in his sleep, or so he thought. The fog became dramatically thicker once he started climbing. Within 2 miles of leaving Decker's Hollow, visibility had dropped to less than 50 feet, and the world outside his windshield had become a uniform gray-white that swallowed his headlight beams and gave back nothing but diffuse illumination. The fog was different from what Creed was used to, denser and more persistent, with a quality that made it seem almost solid. It pressed against his windows and obscured the road edges, forcing him to navigate by feel as much as by sight. Creed reduced his speed to 20 miles per hour and focused on the center line, that yellow stripe becoming his only reliable reference point in a world that had lost all depth and definition. His engine labored as the grade increased, and he could feel the weight of his load pressing against his brakes every time he had to slow for a curve. The switchbacks came at regular intervals, hairpin turns that doubled back on themselves as the road climbed the mountain face. Creed counted them out of habit, using them as landmarks to track his progress. First switchback, then second, then third, the pattern as familiar as breathing. His CB radio crackled with occasional transmissions from other drivers working the area, warning each other about the fog conditions and confirming their positions. Creed checked in at regular intervals, calling out his location and asking if anyone ahead of him had information about when the fog might lift. The responses were sparse and not encouraging. The fog had settled in across the entire mountain range, and weather reports suggested it would last through the night. Around the 5th switchback, Creed noticed something that made him check his GPS with growing confusion. The road felt wrong, not dramatically different, but subtly off in ways he couldn't immediately identify. The curve seemed sharper than he remembered, the grade seemed steeper, and the guardrail on the outside edge appeared to be made of different material than what he recalled from previous trips. He checked his GPS and confirmed he was still on Route 35, still climbing toward Laurel Ridge. But the discrepancy bothered him. He keyed his CB microphone and spoke into Channel 19. "This is Creed Moreland, northbound on Route 35, approaching Laurel Ridge. Anyone familiar with this stretch of road? I'm hitting switchbacks that don't quite match my memory of the route." The response came from a driver heading south, his voice crackling through static. "Copy that, Creed. This is Harlan southbound, about 10 miles ahead of your position. The fog's playing tricks on everybody tonight. Landmarks don't look right when you can't see more than 50 feet in any direction. Just take it slow and trust your GPS." Creed acknowledged the advice and continued climbing, but the feeling of wrongness persisted. He reached what should have been the 6th switchback based on his count, but when he made the turn, the road didn't feel like it was continuing upward. If anything, the grade seemed to flatten out or even descend slightly, which made no sense given his position on the mountain. He checked his GPS again and saw that according to the satellite data, he was exactly where he should be, climbing steadily toward the ridgeline. But something was definitely wrong with the road itself. The pavement under his tires felt different, rougher, and more worn than he remembered. The guardrails appeared and disappeared in the fog with a regular spacing that didn't match his mental map of the road. And most disturbing of all, the switchbacks seemed to be coming at the wrong intervals. He should have cleared the 7th turn by now and been approaching a straight section that ran along the ridge for about 2 miles. Instead, he kept encountering turns that doubled back on themselves, switchbacks that shouldn't exist in this section of the road. Creed pulled over at what appeared to be a small turnout, though he couldn't see more than a few feet beyond his truck in the dense fog. He shut off his engine and sat in the sudden silence, listening to the mountain sounds that filtered through his closed windows. There was wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl, and the steady drip of moisture from the fog condensing on leaves and branches. Normal sounds. Exactly what he would expect to hear on a mountain road at night. But there was also something else, a quality to the silence that felt oppressive, as if the fog was absorbing sound as thoroughly as it absorbed light. He pulled out his physical road map, the old-fashioned paper kind that he kept as backup for when GPS failed or led him wrong. The map showed Route 35 climbing through a series of 8 switchbacks before reaching the ridgeline, then continuing north along relatively flat terrain for several miles before descending the other side of the mountain. Simple, straightforward. Exactly as Creed remembered from dozens of previous trips. But according to his count, he had just navigated at least 10 switchbacks, possibly more. He had lost track somewhere around the 8th turn when the fog had become so thick that counting seemed less important than just maintaining control of his truck. The discrepancy bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Either his memory was faulty, which seemed unlikely given how many times he had driven this road, or something about the route had changed in ways that his GPS wasn't reflecting. Creed started his engine and pulled back onto the road, deciding to continue upward until he reached some landmark he could definitively identify. The ridgeline would have a distinct feel when he reached it, a sense of cresting the mountain and beginning the descent on the other side. He would recognize that transition even in zero visibility. He just needed to keep driving and trust that the confusion was temporary, a product of fog and fatigue combining to play tricks on his perception. The next switchback came almost immediately, catching him by surprise. He had to brake hard to make the turn, and he felt his load shift slightly as momentum carried it forward against the restraints. The turn was tighter than any he had encountered so far, forcing him to swing wide and use both lanes to get his trailer around the curve without scraping the inside guardrail. As he completed the turn and started up the next section of grade, Creed had the unmistakable impression that he had just navigated a switchback he had already driven. The thought was impossible, ridiculous even, but it lodged in his mind and wouldn't let go. The turn had felt familiar in a way that went beyond general knowledge of the road. The specific angle of the curve, the particular way the guardrail was positioned, the small drainage ditch that ran along the inside edge, all of it felt like déjà vu, except more concrete, more real. He had driven this exact turn within the past hour. He was certain of it. Creed checked his GPS and saw that according to the satellite data, he had gained another 200 feet of elevation and was now less than half a mile from the ridgeline. But his odometer showed that he had been climbing for over 12 miles since leaving Decker's Hollow, when the total distance should have been no more than 8 miles. The discrepancy was significant enough that it couldn't be explained by GPS error or faulty instruments. He grabbed his CB microphone again. "This is Creed Moreland on Route 35. I'm experiencing some navigational confusion up here. My GPS shows I'm near the ridge, but my odometer suggests I've traveled much farther than expected. Can anyone confirm the correct distance from Decker's Hollow to Laurel Ridge Summit?" Static filled the channel for several seconds before a new voice responded. older and more authoritative than the previous driver. "This is Lyle Fenwick, West Virginia State Police. I'm monitoring this channel from the valley. Can you describe your exact position and any landmarks you can identify?" Creed described what little he could see through the fog: the narrow two-lane road, the guardrails, the steep grade and tight switchbacks. He mentioned the discrepancy between his GPS reading and his odometer, and he admitted that he felt like he might be driving in circles despite the GPS showing steady forward progress. Trooper Fenwick's response was measured and professional, but Creed detected a note of concern underneath the calm tone. "Mr. Moreland, I need you to stay on the line with me. I'm familiar with Route 35 and I can help you navigate to a safe stopping point. But I need you to be very careful and pay close attention to your surroundings. The fog in the mountains can create some unusual conditions and I want to make sure you stay oriented." "What kind of unusual conditions?" Creed asked, not sure he wanted to hear the answer. "Visibility this poor can cause sensory confusion. Drivers sometimes perceive loops or repetitions in the road that don't actually exist. It's a documented phenomenon related to how the brain processes incomplete visual information. The solution is to find a safe place to pull over and wait for the fog to lift." Creed wanted to follow that advice, but the road he was on offered no safe places to stop. The shoulder was narrow to non-existent, and the grade was steep enough that parking would be dangerous even with wheel chocks. He needed to reach the ridgeline where the road flattened out and offered wider shoulders and better visibility. He just needed to keep climbing until he got there. "I'm going to continue to the ridge," Creed told the trooper. "I should be there in less than a mile according to my GPS. Once I'm on flat ground, I'll find a place to pull over and reassess." "Copy that," Fenwick replied. "But if you encounter anything unusual or if your instruments start showing inconsistent readings, I want you to stop immediately and call me back. I'm going to stay on this channel and monitor your progress." Creed acknowledged and continued driving, feeling slightly better knowing that someone was tracking his position and ready to help if needed. But the unease didn't leave him, especially when he encountered the next switchback and felt that same jolt of recognition. He had driven this turn before, he was absolutely certain of it. The specific configuration of the guardrail, the way the road banked at a particular angle, even the pattern of cracks in the pavement. All of it was identical to a turn he had navigated earlier. He completed the switchback and accelerated up the next grade, his hands gripping the wheel tightly enough to make his knuckles ache. His GPS showed the ridgeline approaching, just a few hundred yards ahead. But when he reached what should have been the crest of the climb, the road didn't flatten out. Instead, it curved into another switchback, the 19th or 20th by his count, and started climbing even steeper than before. Creed felt a spike of genuine fear cut through his confusion. He was trapped in some kind of loop, driving the same section of road repeatedly despite his GPS insisting he was making forward progress. The phenomenon Trooper Fenwick had mentioned, sensory confusion caused by limited visibility, didn't explain why his odometer was reading excessive mileage, or why every detail of the switchbacks matched his memory so precisely. He keyed his CB again, this time with urgency clear in his voice. "Trooper Fenwick, I've got a serious problem. I'm not reaching the ridgeline. The road keeps climbing and the switchbacks keep coming. My GPS says I should be at the summit, but I'm clearly still ascending." Fenwick's response was immediate. "Can you see any mile markers or road signs? Anything that would confirm your position?" Creed strained to see through the fog, but visibility had deteriorated even further. The fog now had a strange luminous quality, as if it was reflecting his headlights back from multiple angles simultaneously. He couldn't see the road edges clearly, couldn't identify any markers or signs, couldn't even be certain he was still on pavement rather than gravel or dirt. "Negative on visual confirmation," Creed reported. "The fog is too thick. I can barely see the hood of my truck." All right, listen carefully. I want you to stop your vehicle wherever you are. Set your parking brake and your hazards. Don't try to continue in these conditions. I'm going to dispatch a unit to come up the mountain and find you." Creed wanted to follow that instruction, but something about stopping in the middle of a grade while trapped in this impossible loop felt even more dangerous than continuing. What if another vehicle came up behind him in the fog? What if his brakes failed while he was parked on this steep incline? What if he was stuck here until morning, trapped in a section of road that apparently repeated itself endlessly? Before he could respond to Fenwick, his headlights caught something ahead that made him ease off the accelerator. There were lights visible through the fog. Not headlights from an approaching vehicle, but stationary lights that suggested a building or structure. As Creed drew closer, the lights resolved into a recognizable pattern. A gas station, closed for the night but with exterior security lights illuminating a small parking area and 2 fuel pumps. Relief flooded through Creed as he pulled into the parking lot and brought his truck to a stop. He was no longer trapped on the endless switchbacks, no longer caught in the disorienting loop of climbing road. He was at a gas station where he could get his bearings, confirm his position, and figure out what had gone wrong with his navigation. The station was small and appeared to be quite old, with a design that suggested it had been built in the 1960s or 70s and hadn't been significantly updated since. The building was constructed of concrete blocks painted white, with a large plate glass window facing the parking lot and a hand-lettered sign above the door that read, "Pike's Gas and Sundries." The fuel pumps were antique models, mechanical rather than digital, with the kind of rolling number displays that Creed associated with vintage car shows rather than working gas stations. Creed shut off his engine and sat in his cab for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. According to his GPS, he was still on Route 35, approximately 3/4 of a mile from the Laurel Ridge summit. But the gas station wasn't on any of his maps, and he had no memory of ever seeing it during his many trips along this route. The building looked closed, with no lights visible inside and no vehicles in the parking lot other than an old pickup truck that appeared to have been abandoned. He keyed his CB to update Trooper Fenwick. "I've found a gas station at what my GPS shows as Route 35 near the ridge. It's called Pike's Gas and Sundries. I'm pulling over here to assess the situation." The response that came back was heavy with static, as if the fog was interfering with radio transmission. "Copy, Moreland. Never heard of. Station on that. Be careful. Inconsistencies." The transmission broke up completely, leaving Creed alone with just the sound of his idling engine and the oppressive silence of the fog. He tried calling back several times but received no response. Either the trooper's radio had failed or the terrain was blocking transmission. Creed was on his own for the moment. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of his cab, immediately feeling the cold, damp air of the fog settle on his skin. The temperature had dropped significantly since he started climbing, and his breath formed visible clouds that merged with the surrounding mist. The parking lot was cracked and weedy, with grass growing through the asphalt in patterns that suggested decades of neglect. The fuel pumps looked functional but ancient, and the price sign showed rates that were impossibly low, less than $1 per gallon. Creed walked toward the building, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog and illuminating the windows. He could see inside through the plate glass, and what he saw made him stop in his tracks. The interior of the gas station was fully stocked and appeared to be in active use. There were shelves lined with canned goods and packaged snacks, a refrigerator case containing drinks, and a checkout counter with an old mechanical cash register. Everything was neat and organized, as if someone had just closed up for the night with plans to reopen in the morning. But the products on the shelves looked wrong. The packaging designs were outdated, the brand names unfamiliar or obsolete. Creed recognized some of them from his childhood. products that hadn't been manufactured in 30 years. There were cigarette advertisements on the walls showing brands that had been discontinued before Creed was born. The calendar hanging behind the counter was turned to November 1985. Creed felt his pulse quicken as the implications sank in. He wasn't looking at an abandoned gas station that had been preserved as some kind of historical curiosity. He was looking at a gas station that appeared to be operating as if the year was 1985, stocked with products from that era and maintained according to the standards of that time. He tried the door and found it locked, which was both reassuring and frustrating. Reassuring because it confirmed the place was closed and he wasn't expected to interact with whoever might be inside. Frustrating because he desperately wanted to go inside and confirm what he was seeing, to prove to himself that this was real and not some elaborate hallucination brought on by fog and stress. As Creed stood at the door trying to peer deeper into the building, he heard a sound that made him spin around. It was the crunch of gravel under tires, coming from somewhere beyond the fog. A vehicle was approaching, moving slowly and cautiously through the limited visibility. Headlights appeared, dim and diffuse through the mist, growing gradually brighter as the vehicle entered the parking lot. It was a pickup truck, old and battered, with the boxy styling of vehicles from the 1980s. The truck pulled up next to the fuel pumps and shut off its engine. A figure stepped out, moving with the slow deliberation of someone who wasn't surprised to find another vehicle at a closed gas station in the middle of the night. The figure walked toward Creed, resolving into an elderly woman as she entered the circle of illumination from the security lights. She was wearing a heavy coat and a knit cap, and her face was lined with age and weather exposure. When she spoke, her voice was surprisingly strong despite her apparent age. "You look lost, son. That truck of yours seems a bit out of place up here in the high country." Creed gestured toward the building. "I was trying to figure out where I am. My GPS says I'm on Route 35, but I don't remember this gas station being here. Is it yours?" The woman nodded slowly, studying Creed with an expression that suggested she was evaluating more than just his words. "It's mine, has been for 43 years. Name's Salome Pike, and you are right to be confused because this station isn't on most maps anymore. Hasn't been for a long time." "Why not?" Creed asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Salome Pike smiled, but there was sadness in the expression. "Because, son, you're not where you think you are. The fog brought you here, same as it's brought others over the years. And the question you need to ask yourself isn't where you are. It's whether you can find your way back to where you're supposed to be." Creed stared at Salome Pike, trying to process what she had just said. "The fog brought you here." The words hung in the cold mountain air like a physical presence, and Creed found himself looking around the parking lot as if expecting to see evidence of some supernatural force that could pluck trucks off highways and deposit them in places that didn't exist on maps. "I don't understand," Creed said, keeping his voice level despite the growing unease in his chest. "The fog is just weather. It doesn't bring people anywhere. I drove here following Route 35, same as I always do." Salome nodded slowly, her expression patient in a way that suggested she had explained this before to other confused travelers. "Route 25 is where you started, that's true enough. But somewhere on those switchbacks when the fog got thick enough to erase the world, you took a wrong turn. Not a physical turn, mind you. Your GPS wouldn't register it and your odometer would keep counting miles like everything was normal. But you turned off the regular road and onto one of the old paths, the ones that run alongside the highway but don't quite follow the same rules." Creed wanted to dismiss this as the rambling of an eccentric old woman, but the evidence of his own experience made that difficult. He had counted at least 20 switchbacks when there should have been only 8. His odometer had registered 12 miles of climbing when the distance should have been 8 at most. And now he was standing in front of a gas station that appeared to be frozen in 1985, stocked with products that hadn't existed for decades. "How many people has this happened to?" Creed asked. "Enough that I stopped being surprised when someone pulls in here looking confused and frightened. It happens maybe 3 or 4 times a year during fog season, always at night, always when visibility drops below a certain threshold. The fog creates conditions where the old paths become accessible, and drivers who aren't paying close attention find themselves on roads that don't behave the way roads should." Creed thought about Trooper Fenwick's explanation of sensory confusion caused by limited visibility. That was a rational, scientific explanation for what he was experiencing. But it didn't account for the gas station with its 1985 calendar and obsolete products. It didn't explain how Salome Pike could be operating a business in a location that apparently didn't exist on any map. "If this place isn't on the maps," Creed said, "how do you get supplies? How do you survive up here?" Salome gestured toward the old pickup truck parked near the pumps. "I make runs down to the valley when I need to. The road goes both ways, son. Getting here's the hard part. Once you're here, leaving is just a matter of knowing which turn to take and when to take it. That's what I'm going to help you understand." She pulled a key ring from her coat pocket and unlocked the door to the gas station. "Come inside. We need to have a conversation, and it's too cold to do it out here in the fog." Creed hesitated, every instinct warning him that following this strange woman into a building that shouldn't exist was a terrible idea. But he was out of better options. His CB radio wasn't working, his phone had no signal, and the fog showed no signs of lifting. He needed information, and Salome Pike seemed to be the only person who understood what was happening. The interior of the gas station was exactly as it had appeared through the window. Shelves stocked with vintage products, a refrigerator case humming quietly in the corner, and that mechanical cash register sitting on the counter like an artifact from a museum. But what struck Creed most was the smell. It wasn't the musty odor of a long-abandoned building. It was the smell of a working business. Coffee, motor oil, and the faint sweetness of candy bars and packaged snacks. Salome moved behind the counter and started a coffee maker. Another vintage model that percolated rather than dripped. "Sit down, son. This explanation takes a few minutes, and you look like you could use something hot to drink." Creed sat on a stool near the counter, his eyes scanning the products on the shelves. He recognized brands he hadn't seen since childhood, packaging designs that triggered memories of gas stations his father had stopped at during family road trips. Everything was authentic, not reproduction or nostalgia items, but actual products from the 1980s, preserved in what appeared to be perfect condition. "How long have you been here?" Creed asked. "Running this station?" "I opened Pike's Gas and Sundries in 1982, Salome said as she poured 2 cups of coffee. Back then, Route 35 was a busy road, lots of traffic heading through the mountains. My husband and I thought we'd found the perfect location, right at the base of Laurel Ridge, where drivers would need fuel before the climb. Business was good for the first few years, then things started changing." She handed Creed a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "The state built a new section of highway about 5 miles west of here, a straighter route with better grades and wider lanes. Traffic started using that road instead of the old Route 35. Within a year, we went from seeing 100 vehicles a day to maybe 10. Within 2 years, the state officially closed this section of road and rerouted everything to the new highway." "But you stayed," Creed said. "Didn't have much choice. We'd put everything we had into this place, and nobody wanted to buy a gas station on a closed road. My husband passed in 1987, and I figured I'd just run the station until I died too. Except something strange started happening. Every now and then during foggy nights, I'd hear vehicles on what was supposed to be a closed road. I'd look out and see trucks or cars pulling into my parking lot, drivers looking confused and asking where they were. Salome sipped her coffee, her eyes distant with memory. At first, I thought they were lost, that they'd missed the turn for the new highway and ended up on the old road by mistake. But their stories didn't make sense. They'd all been driving on the active Route 35 following their GPS when suddenly they found themselves here. Some of them had been counting switchbacks and realized they were trapped in some kind of loop, driving the same curves over and over. Others had just noticed that the road didn't match their memory and pulled over when they saw my lights. "How is that possible?" Creed asked, though he already knew the answer wouldn't be satisfying. "The mountains have their own rules, son, always have. There are places in these hills where reality gets thin, where the past and present overlap in ways that don't make logical sense. This section of Old Route 35 is one of those places. When conditions are right, thick fog, darkness, a driver's mind drifting between attention and distraction, the road becomes accessible, even though it officially doesn't exist anymore." Creed wanted to reject this explanation as superstition or delusion, but he couldn't argue with his own experience. He had driven onto a road that looped impossibly on itself, and had ended up at a gas station that operated as if the year was 1985. Those were facts, regardless of how impossible they seemed. "How do I get back?" Creed asked. "You said leaving is just a matter of knowing which turn to take. What does that mean?" Salome set down her coffee cup and pulled out a hand-drawn map from beneath the counter. The map showed a section of mountainous terrain with two parallel roads marked in different colors. One road was labeled Route 35 New and showed a relatively straight path through the mountains. The other was labeled Route 35 Old and showed a much more convoluted route with dozens of switchbacks and curves. "You're here," Salome said, pointing to a location on the old road near the top of Laurel Ridge. "The new highway is about 5 miles west of us. To get back to it, you need to continue up the old road to the actual ridge line, then take a specific turn that will bring you across to the new road. The turn isn't marked and your GPS won't show it, but I can describe it well enough that you'll recognize it when you see it." "What if I just turn around and go back the way I came?" Salome shook her head. "Doesn't work that way. The path that brought you here only goes one direction. If you try to backtrack, you'll end up in the loop again, driving those same switchbacks until you run out of fuel or your brakes fail. Forward is the only option." Creed studied the map, trying to memorize the landmarks Salome was pointing out. There was a distinctive rock formation about half a mile past the true ridge line, shaped like a broken tooth, and visible even in fog if you knew what to look for. Just beyond that formation would be an unmarked gravel road branching off to the west. That gravel road would take him down a steep grade and eventually connect to the new Route 35 about 3 miles north of where he had left it. "How many people have you helped this way?" Creed asked. "Dozens over the years. Most of them make it back to the new highway without trouble. A few don't." The casual way Salome said that last part made Creed's stomach tighten. What happens to the ones who don't make it? Some of them panic and try to force their way back instead of following the path forward. They end up crashing on the switchbacks or driving off the edge where the guardrails are weak. Some of them refuse to believe what's happening and keep driving, thinking they'll eventually reach the ridge and everything will make sense. Those ones usually run out of fuel while they're still in the loop. "And then what?" Salome's expression was sad but matter-of-fact. "Then they become part of the mountain. The old road doesn't give people back once they run out of options. It just keeps them here, stuck in a moment that never quite ends." Creed thought about the abandoned pickup truck he had seen in the parking lot when he first arrived. Is that what happened to the owner of that old truck outside? "That truck belonged to my husband. He died of a heart attack right here in the station in 1987. I buried him up on the ridge where he liked to watch the sunrise. The truck stays here as a reminder that some people never leave these mountains, one way or another." The coffee in Creed's cup had gone cold while they talked, but he drank it anyway, needing the caffeine and the ritual of normalcy. His mind was working through the implications of what Salome had told him. If he followed her directions and found the unmarked turn, he might be able to get back to the real Route 35 and continue his trip as if this detour had never happened. But if he made a mistake, if he missed the turn or took the wrong branch, he could end up trapped here permanently or dead at the bottom of a ravine. "I need to ask you something," Creed said, "and I need you to be completely honest. Is any of this real? Is this gas station real? Are you real? Or am I experiencing some kind of mental breakdown brought on by stress and fog?" Salome smiled, and for the first time, the expression reached her eyes. "That's a fair question, and I can't give you an answer that will satisfy you completely. All I can tell you is that every driver who comes through here asks the same thing, and every driver who follows my directions makes it back to the new highway, where they can verify that time passed normally, and their GPS shows a reasonable route. Whether this place exists in the way you understand existence, I couldn't say, but it's real enough to help you find your way home if you're willing to trust what I'm telling you." Creed made his decision. He had no better options and no reason to doubt that Salome's directions would work. "All right, I'll follow your map. But before I go, I need to try my CB radio one more time. There's a state trooper who was monitoring my position, and he's probably worried about where I disappeared to." Salome nodded toward the door. "You can try, but the fog interferes with radio signals up here. Most drivers can't reach anyone until they're back on the new highway." Creed walked back to his truck and climbed into the cab, immediately feeling more secure in the familiar environment. He grabbed his CB microphone and keyed Channel 19. "This is Creed Moreland calling Trooper Fenwick. Can you read me?" The response came through broken by static but audible. "Creed, this is Fenwick. Lost your signal. What's your position?" "I found a gas station on what appears to be an old section of Route 35. The owner is giving me directions to get back to the active highway. I'm going to continue north and try to reach the ridgeline." "Copy that. Be extremely careful. GPS shows you in an area where closed 30 years ago. Doesn't make sense." The transmission broke up completely, and Creed couldn't raise the trooper again. But he had confirmed that someone in the normal world knew approximately where he was and would be looking for him if he didn't report in soon. That knowledge was reassuring even if it didn't change his immediate situation. Salome was standing in the doorway of the gas station when Creed started his engine. She raised one hand in a brief wave, and Creed returned the gesture before pulling out of the parking lot and back onto the narrow mountain road. In his mirrors, he watched the lights of Pike's Gas and Sundries fade into the fog until they disappeared completely, leaving him alone in the white void. The climb to the true ridgeline took another 20 minutes of careful driving through fog that seemed to grow thicker with each passing mile. Creed counted the switchbacks again, this time noting that they came at regular intervals that matched what he remembered from previous trips. The loop had released him, or perhaps it had never existed in the first place, and his perception had just been distorted by the fog and the stress of navigating in zero visibility. He reached the ridgeline and felt the distinct sensation of cresting the mountain, the grade flattening out, and the road beginning its long descent on the northern side of Laurel Ridge. His GPS showed him exactly where he should be, right on course for his destination in Pennsylvania. For a moment, Creed allowed himself to believe that the entire episode at the gas station had been a hallucination, a stress-induced fantasy that his mind had created to explain the confusion of driving in heavy fog. Then he saw the rock formation Salome had described, the broken tooth shape that jutted up from the ridgeline about 30 feet to the right of the road. It was exactly where she had said it would be, distinctive and unmistakable even in the limited visibility. Creed slowed his truck to a crawl and watched for the unmarked gravel road that should appear just beyond the formation. It was there, barely visible in the fog, a narrow track branching off to the west with no signs or markings to indicate where it led. The road looked rough and steep, the kind of route that would be challenging even in good conditions. In the fog, it looked like a path to nowhere, disappearing into white nothingness after just a few yards. Creed sat at the junction of the paved road and the gravel track, his hands on the wheel, trying to decide whether to trust Salome's directions. The rational choice was to stay on the paved road, to continue following his GPS and ignore the unmarked turn. But the rational choice had already failed him once tonight, leading him into an impossible loop that had deposited him at a gas station that shouldn't exist. He thought about Salome's warning that some drivers refused to believe and kept going, eventually running out of fuel while trapped in the loop. He thought about the abandoned vehicles she had mentioned, the people who had become part of the mountain because they ran out of options. And he thought about the simple fact that nothing about tonight had followed normal rules, so expecting normal rules to apply from this point forward seemed like a mistake. Creed turned his wheel and guided his truck onto the gravel road, feeling his tires crunch on loose stone as he left the pavement behind. The descent was steep and treacherous, forcing him to ride his brakes and fight the weight of his load as gravity tried to push him faster than he wanted to go. The fog pressed close on all sides, and Creed had no sense of how far the drop was on either side of the narrow track. For all he knew, he was driving along the edge of a cliff with nothing but air and a long fall waiting if he drifted even slightly off course. The gravel road continued for what felt like miles but was probably less than one, switchbacking down the mountain face in a series of sharp turns that tested Creed's skill and his nerves. He could hear loose rock pinging off his trailer and feel the truck sliding on the steep grade despite his careful braking. This was not a road that commercial trucks were supposed to use, and Creed started to wonder if following Salome's directions had been a terrible mistake. Then, just as he was considering stopping and trying to back up the gravel road, the surface changed. The loose stone gave way to rough pavement, and the grade eased to something more manageable. Creed's headlights caught a familiar sight, a green highway sign reflecting his lights and showing a route number. He had reached the new Route 35, exactly where Salome had said he would, about 3 miles north of where he had lost contact with Trooper Fenwick. Creed pulled onto the highway and stopped on the shoulder, his entire body shaking with relief and residual adrenaline. He grabbed his CB microphone and called out to anyone monitoring the channel. "This is Creed Moreland. I'm back on Route 35 northbound approximately 3 miles past the Laurel Ridge summit. Can anyone copy?" The response came immediately, clear and strong without the static that had plagued earlier transmissions. "Creed, this is Trooper Fenwick. We've been looking for you for the past hour. What happened? Your GPS signal disappeared and we couldn't raise you on the radio." Creed took a deep breath before responding, trying to decide how much of the truth to share. "I encountered heavy fog on the switchbacks and got disoriented. I pulled over at a gas station to get my bearings, then found an alternate route that brought me back to the highway. I'm fine now, ready to continue my trip." "Copy that. I'm going to need you to file a full report when you reach Pennsylvania. We had units searching the old sections of Route 35 and they didn't find any sign of you. I need to understand what happened so we can help other drivers avoid the same situation." Creed agreed to file the report, though he had no intention of mentioning Pike's Gas and Sundries or the impossible loop that had trapped him on a road that supposedly closed in the 1980s. Nobody would believe him, and the story would only raise questions about his mental fitness to drive. Better to stick to the simple version. He got lost in fog, found a way back, and continued his trip. He drove the remaining distance to Pennsylvania without incident, delivered his load on schedule, and spent the following day trying to convince himself that everything he remembered from the previous night was just a fog-induced hallucination. But when he checked his odometer and calculated his fuel consumption, the numbers didn't support that explanation. He had driven significantly more miles than his GPS showed, and he had burned through more fuel than the logged distance would account for. Something had happened on those switchbacks, something that had taken him onto a road that existed outside normal geography. 3 days later, back home in Charleston, Creed received a package in the mail. There was no return address and no note, just a hand-drawn map showing the 2 routes through Laurel Ridge, the new highway and the old road with Pike's Gas and Sundries marked clearly at the top of the grade. On the back of the map, in neat handwriting that he recognized from the calendar in the gas station, was a single sentence. "Thank you for trusting the old paths. Drive safe, son." Creed kept the map in his truck, tucked behind his visor next to his registration and insurance documents. He continued driving the mountain routes through West Virginia and Pennsylvania, though he made a point of avoiding Route 35 during foggy conditions. He listened to CB chatter on Channel 19 and paid attention when other drivers mentioned getting disoriented on the switchbacks or finding landmarks that didn't match their maps. About a month after his experience, Creed heard a transmission that made him pull over and turn up the volume on his CB. It was a driver calling for help, describing how he had been trapped in a loop on the Laurel Ridge switchbacks and couldn't find his way to the summit. The driver's voice was panicked, and his description of the situation matched exactly what Creed had experienced. Creed grabbed his microphone and interrupted the transmission. "Driver on the switchbacks, this is Creed Moreland. I've been through what you're experiencing. You need to watch for a gas station at the top of the grade. It's called Pike's Gas and Sundries. Pull in there and the owner will help you find your way back to the main highway." "I don't see any gas station," the panicked driver responded. "Just fog and more switchbacks. How many times do I have to climb this mountain?" "Keep driving forward," Creed said, keeping his voice calm and authoritative. "Don't try to turn around. The station will appear when you're ready to see it. Trust me on this." The driver didn't respond immediately, but Creed could hear him breathing heavily over the open microphone. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, the voice came back with a note of relief. "I see lights ahead. There's a building with pumps. Pike's Gas and Sundries, just like you said. How did you know?" Creed smiled despite himself. "Because I've been there. Pull in and talk to the owner. She'll get you sorted out, and when you make it back to the highway, do me a favor. Don't try to explain what happened. Nobody will believe you anyway." The driver acknowledged and signed off, presumably pulling into the parking lot where Salome Pike would be waiting with coffee and directions, and the quiet certainty of someone who had helped dozens of lost travelers find their way home. Creed sat in his truck on the side of the highway and wondered how many other drivers had experienced the same thing over the years, how many had followed Salome's directions back to reality, and how many had refused to believe and were still trapped somewhere in the fog. He thought about filing a report with the authorities, trying to warn other drivers about the phenomenon on the Laurel Ridge switchbacks. But what would he say? That there was a section of closed highway that became accessible during foggy conditions and led to a gas station frozen in 1985. That drivers could get trapped in an impossible loop unless they found an unmarked gravel road that connected 2 separate realities. Nobody would take him seriously, and the story would probably end his career as drivers questioned his mental stability. So, Creed kept quiet and continued driving, but he paid attention to the CB chatter and listened for other drivers describing symptoms of the loop. When he heard them, he would offer the same advice he had given the panicked driver. Watch for Pike's Gas and Sundries, trust the owner's directions, and don't try to explain what happened afterward. Over the following months, Creed helped 3 more drivers find their way out of the Laurel Ridge Loop. Each time, the sequence was the same. Panic on the CB as the driver realized they were trapped. Creed's calm instructions to watch for the gas station, and eventually relief as the driver reported finding their way back to the main highway. None of them understood how Creed knew about the gas station or why his directions worked. And Creed never explained, just offered the help and moved on. The question that haunted Creed wasn't whether Pike's Gas and Sundries was real in any conventional sense. He had been there, had drunk coffee with Salome Pike, and had followed her directions to safety. The question was why the phenomenon existed at all, and what it meant that there were places in the mountains where reality bent in ways that couldn't be explained by physics or geography. He did some research in his spare time, digging through old archives and historical records about Route 35 and the Laurel Ridge area. He found references to the road being relocated in 1985, matching Salome's story. He found newspaper articles about accidents on the old switchbacks, including several instances of vehicles disappearing without explanation. He found surveyors' reports from the 1980s that mentioned unusual magnetic anomalies in the Laurel Ridge area that interfered with compass readings and made accurate mapping difficult. What he didn't find was any official record of Pike's Gas and Sundries. The business had never been registered with the state, had never paid taxes, and had never applied for the various permits and licenses required to operate a gas station. According to every official database, the place had never existed. But Creed had the hand-drawn map that had arrived in the mail, physical proof that someone at that gas station knew his home address and cared enough to send him a reminder. About 6 months after his experience, Creed decided to try to find the gas station during daylight hours without fog. He drove Route 35 to the Laurel Ridge area and searched for the turnoff to the old road. He found the general location where the switchbacks should begin, but there was no entrance, no gap in the guardrail, no indication that an alternate route existed. The mountainside was covered in thick forest with no evidence of roads or structures hidden in the trees. He drove the route 3 times, checking different approach angles and watching for any detail he might have missed, but there was nothing. The old Route 35 and Pike's Gas and Sundries existed only in fog and darkness, accessible only when conditions created the kind of sensory deprivation that allowed reality to bend. Creed eventually accepted that he would never fully understand what had happened to him on those switchbacks. He could theorize about dimensional overlaps or time distortions or psychological phenomena that created shared hallucinations, but none of those explanations felt adequate. The experience existed beyond explanation, occupying a space where logic and reason gave way to something older and stranger. But he also accepted that his role wasn't to understand. His role was to help other drivers when they got trapped in the same situation, to offer them the guidance that had saved his life and his sanity. He had become a link in a chain of people who knew about the old paths through the mountains and who passed that knowledge on to those who needed it. 1 year after his experience, Creed was driving through West Virginia on a foggy November night when his CB crackled with a familiar voice. It was Trooper Lyle Fenwick, the state police officer who had been monitoring his position during the original incident. "Creed Moreland, this is Trooper Fenwick. I've got a driver requesting assistance on Route 35 near Laurel Ridge. He says he's been driving the switchbacks for over an hour and can't reach the summit. He mentioned your name, said you'd told him to contact me if he got lost in this area." Creed smiled and grabbed his microphone. "Copy that, Trooper. I'll handle this one. Put the driver through to Channel 17 and I'll talk him through the situation." "Acknowledged. And Creed, when you get a chance, I'd like to hear more about this phenomenon you've been tracking. I've had 6 reports in the past year from drivers who got disoriented on the Laurel Ridge switchbacks. All of them mentioned a gas station that doesn't show up on any maps. I'm starting to think there's something going on that deserves a closer look. Creed thought about how to respond. I think some mysteries are better left unexplored, Trooper. The drivers are getting home safe, and that's what matters. Sometimes the mountains have their own ways of doing things, and we just have to respect that and help people navigate through them. There was a long pause before Fenwick responded. Roger that, Creed. I'll keep monitoring the situation. You keep doing whatever it is you're doing to help those drivers. Fenwick out. Creed switched to Channel 17 and spent the next 30 minutes talking a terrified driver through the process of finding Pike's gas and sundries and following Salome's directions back to the main highway. It was routine by now, a pattern he had practiced enough times that he could guide someone through the steps without thinking too hard about the implications. But as he continued his own journey through the fog-shrouded mountains, Creed couldn't stop thinking about the question that had been growing in his mind over the past year. How long had this been going on? How many drivers had found Pike's gas and sundries over the decades, going all the way back to when the road was first closed in 1985? And how many were still out there in the fog, trapped in loops they couldn't escape, becoming part of the mountain's collection of lost travelers? The fog pressed against his windshield, thick and impenetrable, and somewhere ahead in the darkness, the switchbacks of Laurel Ridge waited for the next driver who would take a wrong turn that wasn't quite physical, and find themselves on a road that existed between one moment and the next. Creed would be there when that happened, listening on Channel 19, ready to offer guidance and help and the knowledge that even the strangest experiences could be navigated with the right directions. The white tunnel closed around his truck as it always did in the mountains, and Creed drove on through the fog, knowing that some roads led to places that couldn't be found on any map, and that some journeys ended in ways that defied explanation. The highway stretched ahead, familiar and mysterious, and Salome Pike's gas station waited somewhere in the fog for the next lost traveler who needed to find their way home. Creed never saw Pike's gas and sundries again, despite driving Route 35 dozens of times over the following years. But he kept the hand-drawn map behind his visor, and he continued helping drivers who got trapped in the Laurel Ridge Loop. And he never stopped wondering about the old woman who had shown him kindness and saved his life on a foggy night when reality had bent just enough to let him pass through. The mountains kept their secrets, and Creed kept driving. And somewhere in the space between the old road and the new, Salome Pike kept her station running for travelers who needed help finding their way back to the world they knew. Some mysteries didn't need solutions. They just needed witnesses willing to believe and pass on the knowledge to those who would come after. And when the fog rolled in thick enough to erase the world, Creed would listen to his CB radio and wait for the next voice calling for help, ready to tell them about a gas station that existed outside time, and an old woman who understood that sometimes the only way forward was to accept that the impossible was real and trust in directions that couldn't be verified on any map. The highway stretched on through the darkness, and Creed Moreland drove it with the certainty of someone who had seen beyond the veil and survived to tell the story, even if he could never fully explain what he had seen or why it mattered. The fog would always return to the mountains, and with it, the old paths would open for those who needed them, and the cycle would continue until the mountains themselves crumbled into dust. Some roads went to places that existed only when you needed them to exist, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, those roads would bring you safely home.